my basic argument is that we should use Hijazi poetry to understand the Quran rather than Najdi poetry. It makes no sense to use this poetry, which is a lot of times you'll have like Professor using like an Umayyad, Tamimi, Najdi poet to explain a term in the Quran. And that really doesn't make any sense when you think about it, because they are later, they're not from the same generation, they're from the other side of the peninsula. And so the conclusion of my book, which is very brief, just sort of, I had reached the conclusion that this book needed to be sort of like a preliminary work towards anyone who wants to do this in the future. And I would love to see that, like a study that is just like, okay, let's just look at Hijazi poetry in as a way to try to understand the Quran's Arabic.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the Real Talk podcast with Tehran and Roxana on Skeps Islamica, where we have a curiosity for all things Islamic and try to see what new perspectives can be achieved based on the latest cutting-edge research in the field of Islamic studies. Today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Nathaniel A. Miller, a distinguished independent translator and scholar of the Arabic language and literature, with us to discuss the fascinating journey of Arabic poetry from its historical roots to the canonization of this material at the hands of Muslim scholarship. To start our discussion centers on Dr. Miller's forthcoming book, The Emergence of Arabic Poetry, From Regional Identities to Islamic Canonization. In this work, Dr. Miller not only presents a captivating history of Arabic poetry, but also re-examines this corpus to reveal insights into pre-Islamic Arabia and its societal role during the first 2 centuries of Islam. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to discuss your upcoming work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and for the invitation and for all of your guys' hard work on the podcast. This is really a wonderful opportunity. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, likewise. I mean, I would have expected you. We kind of expected having you on later on, considering that your book isn't coming out until August. And so for anyone interested, we will have a link in the description for anyone interested in buying his book after watching, and we definitely recommend going out to do so. To start, can you share your personal journey with Arabic poetry? What initially sparked your interest in studying this literature? Was there a specific person, place, or event that influenced you?
Yes, well, that's kind of a long story, so I'll try to make it brief. But for me, let's see here, just try to maybe get rid of my own picture so I'm not looking at myself. Oh, well. Yeah, I think for me, my experience with poetry is really connected with my interest in nature, I think. And just to make that as brief as possible and as related to literature as possible, growing up, as a sort of unhappy adolescent, I read a lot of things like Lord of the Rings and would go for a lot of walks in the woods. I really absorbed a sense of nature as this place where you could go and sort of restore yourself and get away from society and modernity and all of the sort of misery of everyday life. And as I later in life, when I went to college and started doing graduate studies, I focused on English literature. And I think not by coincidence, I was very drawn to British Romantic poetry, so late 18th, early 18th, early 19th century poetry. People like William Wordsworth, William Blake, Samuel Coleridge, Shelley, these kinds of people. And as I was studying it and looking at it more critically from a literary studies perspective, I was very I revised my thinking on how we experience nature, and this is something that I'll maybe come back to. I know you had a question about nature. I write about it a lot in the book. And so I was interested in poetry about nature, but also sort of a critical perspective on that. So just one example, I read an essay, which I can't remember, I've never been able to find it again, but I read an essay about Wordsworth in the Lake District at some point in time, where they were talking about a guidebook to the Lake District that he had written later in his life. And the author of this essay was saying that he gives all these instructions to people who are walking through the Lake District to approach certain views from certain directions and to make sure that they, only approach it from this direction. They'll get this nice picturesque landscape that they'll see. And the reason she establishes, the author of this essay establishes, he was doing that is because there's actually a fair amount of industrialization and mining taking place in the Lake District at that time. And so he would actually steer his reader away from the nasty brutality of the British economy at that time and towards this picturesque experience of nature. And I have I guess that's my most longstanding scholarly obsession. And I went to the Middle East when I was 19 with a study abroad program. And I became very interested in it. After that, I just sort of took every opportunity that I had to learn more about the Middle East and about Arabic. I learned Arabic entirely as an adult. And at some point in my life, I found myself starting a PhD program, which I never finished, at Indiana University, Bloomington. And I studied there a bit with Suzanne Stepkovich, who's now at Georgetown University. She's a prominent Arabic literature scholar. And she really turned me on to an interest in Arabic poetry, and particularly Labid's Mu'allaqah, which has this beautiful description of abandoned campsites at the beginning of the Qasida, the poem, describing the animals, the plants and things that grow in the desert when this campsite has been abandoned. And that was when I first encountered it, it was in Michael Sell's translation. I also studied with him later at the University of Chicago, where I did my PhD. And so I got really drawn into this world of nature in pre-Islamic poetry and trying to understand it. And as I was looking at it, I went into it with an eye towards trying to understand how they were experiencing it, sort of in the same vein as this Wordsworth scenario, where they, one of Stetkovich's main points is that the way that we understand poetry is inherently romantic or post-romantic. We're looking to poetry as a way to sort of, to some extent, escape our everyday lives, or it's something that we do for fun in our free time, it's not a life or death. Poetry is not a life or death issue for most people, and it is for pre-Islamic poets. It is for early Arabic poets, and generally in the medieval Arabic literature tradition more broadly. There's just a really deep, rich, complex relationship between poetry and nature, yes, but also politics. Court poetry starts to influence how they look at nature, how they look at plants and streams and fountains and that kind of thing. It's very important for the early poets to describe the place where they live. They're nomadic, and so that was sort of broadly what brought me into it. And I've also been very interested in a relationship between spirituality and the description of nature in poetry, which is something else that I brought with me into early Arabic poetry, because of course it's used to understand the Quran. And I think I approached it in a way from the wrong angle initially when I started studying it, because it is another argument that literary scholars have made, that romantic poetry, English romantic poetry, took place at the same time as a secularization was occurring in British society and Western society. And in a way, nature kind of stood in for a lot of spiritual values that at that time people were wrestling with because of new discoveries in geology, evolution, biblical scholarship. And so they could look to nature as something to sort of replace these lost spiritual values that they found difficult to subscribe to entirely. This is certainly the case with the poets, not with society more broadly necessarily, like if we're talking about the year 1800. So I went in there digging around, looking for that, looking for, what was this connection to nature or God's creation that early Muslims, early Arabian poets were exploring in their work. And the book, to a large extent, is a exploration of how I didn't find what I was looking for. I wound up with a pretty different explanation for how everything works.
I mean, I imagine as Arabic poetry was developing, the quite opposite was happening compared to 18th century Britain, where religious transformations were rapidly happening while Arabic poetry were emerging. So yeah, totally opposite of, so I
Yeah.
think, yeah, you didn't find what you were looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the case. I mean, and I don't know, just in general, like a larger point that from studying pre-modern cultures in general, Arabic poetry, medieval Islamic societies, is that nature was a scary place for these people. And if you were surviving in the desert as a poet, you were tough, and it wasn't about enjoying mountain streams and that kind of thing, or sunsets or rainbows, all of which I love. But it was about being able to survive in this environment. And then later, being able to control nature in the form of a palace or gardens attached to a palace becomes connected to just expressions of settled culture, Islamic culture, and Islamic leaders use palaces and gardens and that kind of thing. Poets describe them as a way of talking about the relationship between a ruler and God, or a ruler and his sort of place in the universe. Being able to control nature a little bit, because it is a frightening force for people in that time. They just did not have, well, we still don't have control over nature, but we think we do. And they didn't have the same ability to just sort of, like I did last night, go for a drive in the mountains and go for a little hike and then come back and sleep in a comfortable house. They had to put a lot more work into it.
Right. I mean, and your interest in nature is definitely demonstrated in the two chapters of 6 and 7, where you really get into how the natural phenomena inspired much of the poetry, as well as affected its content. Well, and so Dr. Miller, the most challenging part of scripting this podcast was deciding where to begin. I mean, your book is very intricate, way more than what we thought it was going to be on the outset of reading it. Your book starts at the end of Arabic poetry's development, then backtracks to its origins, finally bringing us full circle in chapters 8 and 9. I decided we should start our podcast with Tah Hussein's on Jahili poetry. Not only is this where you somewhat begin your book, but Hussein's views also had a significant impact on myself, especially in how they changed my perspective on the historical value of Arabic poetry and understanding the emergence of Islam. Could you provide an overview of Tah Hussein's on pre-Islamic poetry or on Jahili poetry, including his approach and methods? What evidence did he present for his claims that much of Jahili poetry was fabricated or modified after Islam, his most controversial take? And how did this impact subsequent scholarly debates?
Yeah. So this is something that I decided to begin the book with, because I just had so many conversations with people and just inquiries from people. I would, at academic workshops and things, I would meet people and they'd say, oh, what do you think about, or you do early Arabic poetry? A lot of people, they do Islamic studies and they just might not read poetry at all. They'll be working on hadith or fiqh or something, and or history. Historians often, will anecdotally say, I just skim over the poetry because I know it's basically made up and it's hard to read. And so for a lot of people, I think Tah Hussein's intervention looms very large in discussions of Arabic poetry. And so the history of it is where I start the book. He came up with this argument that that pre-Islamic poetry was more or less forged and not really from the pre-Islamic period. And it caused a huge controversy in Egypt. And what was interesting to me was how connected it was with discussions that were going on with German and British scholars at that time. I mean, they're really just in conversation with each other, which is something that we kind of lack to a certain extent these days, even though we're more globalized. And what he was doing is he was drawing on the work of this Cambridge biblical scholar and Arabic scholar, D.S. Margolieff, who made similar arguments actually about a number of Hebrew texts that they were forged. And Hussein was extremely influenced by this, and wrote on Jahili poetry. His argument is that I think first, in the first place, his intuition is right. A lot of pre-Islamic poetry is made up. if you read Arabic and if you read Arabic poetry a lot, you start to be able to see differences in quality pretty quickly. And so Gilliam, I can't remember his first name now. It's Alfred, the guy who translated the Sirah of the Prophet. He talks about this extensively in his introduction to his translation of Ibn Hisham ibn Ishaq's Sirah. The poetry is just very low quality in there. It has a lot of words that are just not very poetic. Sometimes there's mistakes in the meter. There's often a lot of obvious anachronisms in the poetry, references to things that were happening much later historically that are put into the mouths of early poets at the time of the Prophet. So Tah Hussein is right in a broad way. And I think he was really thinking about this kind of Sirah poetry. And then he tried to extend the argument to all pre-Islamic poetry. And so his argument, which makes sense for a few poems, but which doesn't make sense for the entire corpus, is that Quraysh, right, so the tribe of the Prophet and then the tribe of all of the subsequent caliphs, exercised so much political influence in the early Islamic period that they spurred the poets to fabricate poetry that centered on Quraysh and on the importance of Quraysh. And his argument was that the language itself was the Arabic language was basically the Qurayshi dialect, in which the Quran was revealed, which would make a certain amount of sense given that the Prophet was from this tribe and there were dialects at the time. And so some of the evidence that he presents is that, in the grammarians, there's supposed to be these grammatical differences between different dialects. And so he looked at pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, and it's true, there's very little evidence of different dialects. And that seems to be quite wrong. What later scholars have said is that actually the Arabic used in poetry was a kind of koine, it was a kind of pan-Arabian standard Arabic that everyone was using. And to a certain extent, as it was being collected later in the Islamic period, people sort of fixed things up. So one of the most notorious cases is that hamzas can become just a vowel. The glottal stop can become a vowel in a word like, I don't know, meaning wolf. It can become dib in dialects, and that's still the case with a lot of dialects. They'll pronounce the word for wolf as dib or dib rather than dib. And it doesn't change the meter. It can be a marker of a dialectical feature, but we don't really see very many of these dialectical differences in pre-Islamic poetry. It all seems to have basically the same grammar. He drew on some inscriptional evidence, which he also misinterpreted in a kind of strange way. For example, he thought if Imr al-Qais was from Kenda, which is near Yemen, was located near Yemen, then he should have been composing Arabic in Sabaic, the language of South Arabia, rather than in Arabic, which again, scholars would point out that it's not strange to have a culture where there's one writing system and a different spoken language. This was the case with the Nabateans for a very long time. And or we think it was probably the case. They were making their stone inscriptions in a different language than what they were actually speaking. It's that you see it in Europe all the time with people putting inscriptions up in Latin when they don't speak Latin as an everyday language. They're writing poetry in a different everyday language. So it's not a gotcha to say, oh, Imr al-Qais should have been composing poetry in Sabaic. So he made a lot of these points, and a lot of them are really off the mark, but I mean, I think that it really reoriented the field and really sort of, and it was a bit of a culture clash, him just sort of bringing all of these ideas that were being discussed rather casually in Britain or Germany into to the eye of the Egyptian public, and especially these traditionalist scholars at Al-Azhar with whom he was constantly clashing during this time. So yeah, I decided to start off at that point because he makes so many good points, and people still really discuss him a lot. When I lived in Egypt and I said that I was interested in pre-Islamic poetry, I would very often hear people say, "Oh, what do you think about Tah Hussein?" Just when I was in coffee shops or something. So it's really very still a living issue that I tried to address and just sort of lay out what the what he gets right and what he gets wrong. And he's got a lot of great points and a lot that are quite off the mark.
And you mentioned the translation of Ibn Ishaq by Alfred. I believe he's a French gentleman. Maybe Roxana can pronounce his last name better than I could, and I'm not going to attempt. But I remember reading his introduction and how that also had an impact me in how I viewed pre-Islamic or Arabic poetry, early Arabic poetry, because he found it to be very doubtful. And then when I read, some call it pseudo Waqidi, the conquest of Isham is filled with poetry as well, and it only gets worse. And those three in combination totally solidified in my mind that this genre of literature, in terms of its value in learning about Islam, is invaluable. So that's why when I heard your book came out and its attempt to kind of sort these or smoothen some of these issues out, I was really excited to read it. So
yeah.
In contrast to Tah Hussein and other scholars, in your book, you try to move beyond viewing early Arabic poetry as simply authentic or inauthentic, and describe it instead as sort of highly contingent and multi-layered. How do you think the perspective that you're bringing enhances historical research and particularly affects the poetry's historical value?
So to answer that question, and then to sort of continue off of some of the points that Tarana was just saying, and a couple of points that I was just making about the Sira and the kind of poetry that Tah Hussein was looking at. There's different kinds of sources for poetry. And so when I said that it was highly contingent, one of the things that people, I think literary scholars, basically these two terms, they sound kind of like, when I look at them now, they sound sort of like jargony fluff a little bit, highly contingent. I don't know, and in academic stuff, everything seems to be contingent. So what I mean by that is that even though literary scholars are constantly saying that they recognize the contingency of language, they still have a methodological need to establish a fixed text before they write an article and submit it for peer review. And it gets very difficult to look at an early Arabic poem. And these things are often come down to us in multiple versions from different transmitters. Those different versions will have different line orders. They'll have different words, like a lot of the words will be synonyms, or there will be lines that are missing. And when you try and say, well, what does this actually mean? You end up telling the story of the transmission of the poem rather than the poem itself. And literary studies, as we do it in Western universities, is really poorly situated, I think, to deal with this kind of text. And if anyone wants to really, confront the reality of this, I'd recommend reading James Montgomery, the professor of Arabic literature at Cambridge. His first book, you'd have to dig it up from somewhere. I think it's out of print. The Vagaries of the Qasida. And I mean, it's really a very challenging read because he takes this problem seriously, and he tries to look at poems that have all these variants and say, well, what if we read it this way? What if we read it that way? How does it appear in this chronicle? How does it appear in this collection of poems? So that's what I meant by highly contingent, and that's something that I basically bracket in my book because I wanted it to be readable. So I also act as though there's fixed texts, when in fact there's often multiple versions of these floating around. And by multi-layered, I mean that we need to try to figure out what time period they're from. And rather than saying, oh, this is forged or not forged, and that one of the examples that I latched onto, just because we have a good study of it, is, and it connects to this Sira issue, is Hassan ibn Thabit's poetry. So he's supposedly from Medina. He praises the Prophet during the Prophet's lifetime. There's stories about him in the Sira. And so his poetry was carefully studied by Walid Arafat at the University of London in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And he wrote a bunch of essays that dealt with the question of the authenticity of his poetry and the introduction to the edition of the Diwan, which is the authoritative edition these days, has all of these great insights into which some of the poems he thinks are authentic. I mean, some of them could be from that very earliest period of the Islamic community. But a lot of them you can show that they're about fights between, the Ansar, from which Hassan was, he was a member of that during the Prophet's lifetime, but they continued to be a demographic reality in Medina and the rest of the Islamic world, I mean, up until today, really, but during the Umayyad period. the Ansar had a claim to legitimacy, which was at odds with the Umayyad dynasty, and it came to military conflict during the First Civil War. And so you see references to stuff happening in the 680s, the 690s, in Hassan ibn Thabit's early poetry, and Arafat lays all of this out. And so one of the points that I make in the book is that, all right, it's not from the 620s or when we want it to be from, but it is from later on, and it can tell us about this time period. So there's different layers to Hassan ibn Thabit's Diwan. There's early stuff, there's later stuff which is made up. And it actually tells us a lot, rather than just throwing it out and saying this is authentic, this is forged, this is garbage, like Gilliam says. We can look at it and try and use it. There's a funny thing about Alfred Gilliam. I'm just pronouncing his name like that. I was told by a fellow graduate student, Jeremy Becky, at the University of Chicago, that he had been told by these. I was actually thinking about this as I was preparing for the podcast. You read about these scholars, and often you don't know really like what was going on in their life or who they were connected to or whatever. So I think Gilliam, he said that Gilliam was English, and the English, as always, change the pronunciation of French names or German names or whatever if they get anglicized. So yeah, I always thought it was Guillaume, which would be the French.
That's what I thought it was. Guillaume.
Yeah, I would have thought Guillaume as well, but
yeah. And so I was told this like oral academic lore that he's British and that's pronounced Gilliam as an anglicization of what was obviously originally the French name. I might be wrong about that, but anyway, so that's how I'll say his name for the time being. So yeah, I think if we look at it, rather than trying to analyze, I think sometimes, especially in Britain, North America, when literary studies people start reading a poem, they really get into these very in-depth, intricate analyses, and a lot of the times more careful attention to the manuscript tradition would just refute their points that they're trying to make. So we need to look at the whole thing as much as possible, and also, historically, it can have a lot of value if we just sort of situate it, like I said, this multi-layered analysis first, and then it can be used rather than going and saying, a historian might pick up the Diwan of Hassan ibn Thabit and say, okay, well, this is all made up, I'm not going to use it, or this is authentic, I'm going to use it. But there's some preparatory work that needs to be done first. And sometimes that's just a matter of going and finding a literary scholar who's written about it already. But other times scholars need to do that work a bit first before they use a poem or a poet to try to make larger arguments about early Islamic history or whatever it is that they're talking about.
In your introduction, you state that the first argument of your book is sort of negative and critical, that the pre-Islamic poets did not think of themselves as either sort of pre-Islamic or Arab. Could you break down how you reached that conclusion a little bit, and why is it such a central argument in your book?
Yeah, so I think part of this, when I sat down and started writing my dissertation, which is what my book is based on, there were two things that I think were being discussed quite a bit. One of them was from Islamic history, and one of them was from Quranic studies at the University of Chicago. So one of them was the late antique context for the late antique context for the Quran. This is like Angelica Neuwert's argument, and she was at the University of Chicago on a visiting thing for a trimester or something. I took a class with her. And so I really absorbed this. I was really convinced by it immediately. I'm a very Arabic first guy. When I lived in Egypt for 3 years from 2007 to 2010, I spent a long time trying to get good at Arabic. So when I got to the University of Chicago, the other guy who was there was Fred Donner, and he was one of the readers of my dissertation. I took several classes with him. And with his students, I wasn't one of his history students. He was saying, okay, you got to learn Greek, you've got to learn Syriac, you've got to learn all of these other languages. And that was not for me. I'd spent so much time learning Arabic, I didn't want to go and compare the Quran or Chronicles to Syriac hagiography. It's just I used a little bit of Syriac hagiography in my book, and it's very interesting, but it's the exact same thing as Arabic poetry. You need to really like have the preparatory work done for you before you just pick it up off the shelf and start using it. So those were the two things. And one of the things that Fred Donner was really arguing is that we shouldn't call them Arabs. We should use the term Arabians for the Arabs. We know at this point in a late antique context that there were a lot of different people kicking around in the Arabian Peninsula. So there was whatever was going on in Yemen in the century before the rise of Islam. There was a lot going on there. The intervention from Aksum, modern day Ethiopia. There are Sabaic inscriptions up until around 570. So different languages, different ethnic groups. There's this relationship with Ethiopia that the first Hydra supposedly sent this mission to this Christian state. So what's an Arab? What's an Arabian in this context? It's really it's not a helpful term. And in terms of literature, Peter Webb's book came out in 2016, which was the year that I graduated. So I sort of came across his work at the end of my dissertation on this, but we kind of reached the same conclusion from different points of view. And he makes a lot of excellent points and draws a lot of pieces of good evidence. For example, one of the things, and this fits in with Tah Hussein's point, pre-Islamic Arabic poets very rarely refer to themselves by the word Arab. They are usually using, when they want to talk about everybody that they want to imagine speaking their language, they talk about Ma'ad or occasionally Mudar. But like there's this Ma'ad, which is in the Islamic period genealogies, Ma'ad is an ancestor of all of the northern Arabs. But in the poetry, you get the sense that it's like the public. They say all of Ma'ad knows about my bravery or my fighting ability or something like that. I want to tell all of Ma'ad about something. And so they're using this term instead of Arabs. So it really, in every way, in terms of our methodological interest in late antiquity, and also if you look at the Arabic texts themselves, they don't seem to be thinking about themselves as Arabs. And Webb points out that you really start to see this develop, and I agree with him, in the later Umayyad period, where poets start to say, out of this or out of that. So that's the negative part, is getting rid of this thing of saying these are Arab poets. And this is something that that you see quite a bit in Quranic studies and history. People want to sort of make a generalization about what pre-Islamic Arabia was like, and they say Arab society at that time, or the Arab mind, which is the most essentializing way to put it. And there wasn't one based on the poetry. They were living in different parts of the peninsula. They were speaking the same language, but they had quite a different way of writing poetry anyway, is the main argument of my book. So that was where it came from for me in terms of my, whatever, but also just looking at that as I sat there reading through all of this poetry, I couldn't help but agree that these two tendencies were really onto something, and that we need to get rid of this idea. And the worst version of this that I think really is, no scholar takes this seriously anymore, but Trisha Kronos sort of flirted with it for a bit, is that Islam is sort of an Arab consciousness coming into being or something, that is not a spiritual movement, but that it is sort of a proto-nationalist way of unifying all the Arabs so that you don't take over the Middle East. And that just makes no historical sense. I mean, there's a lot of things in the traditional accounts that don't jive with each other, that are contradictory, but then going and saying, oh, this was the Arabs instead of the Muslims, makes it even worse. That's you get a much more rich picture of the period once you get rid of that. And it's nothing against Arabs per se, it's just looking at these poets. They're really into their tribe. They were living in relatively localized areas. They were pretty mobile, but they were generally not going back and forth between Iraq and Yemen, or between Oman and Jordan or something like that. They were usually in one of those quadrants. Yeah.
Very interesting. one question that I do have concerning that, I guess I'll start by asking, have you seen a presentation by Rashid Goyal on the term al-Arab, or what is commonly translated as Bedouin, when the Quran speaks negatively of this certain group, Arab, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But long story short, sorry, I'll give you a chance to answer. I didn't mean to.
Oh yeah, so just quickly about that, I think it's the term al-Arab is so there's two terms in the Quran. There's al-Arab, which is the Bedouin or the nomads. I did see something about that, but I think it was probably something online.
It is worth watching, and I was going to construct questions from that for this podcast. I ended up not doing it, but I guess according to him, there is a term, or there was a collective term used to represent the whole of the Arabs, and Arab was, I guess, that term, or he mentioned something of Arib, which was later changed into another term to mean the collective of Arabs. So it's a very, very interesting presentation. I would have to go back and watch it again. I was just wondering if you might have seen it, if you wanted to comment on that, because it seems a bit juxtaposed to what you were saying. And I just wanted to see if your thoughts of how that worked.
Yeah, the assumption that I'm operating on in the book, which I think what you're describing might be a challenge to, is the reading of al-Arab in the Quran as the nomads, as nomadic Arabs, and that's the assumption that I operate on in the book. And I think it actually works fine for my book, because I think from the point of view of the Islamic sort of cultural tradition, that becomes the dominant reading in tafsir and exegesis. And so if that is correct, if it's correct that Arab means nomads, then that's fine. If it's not correct, then that might be historically interesting, but over the course of the Islamic tradition, that's usually been understood as the nomads. And I think what you do see in the later period is a conflation between those two things. And I think that's the general movement, I feel, and I think the emphasis in Quranic studies has been on this, that the early Muslims were relatively urban, cosmopolitan Hijazis. Mecca and Medina had certainly a very important relationship with their hinterlands, with the tribes, however that worked. There's a lot of material about it. And this is one of the main things that I just can't help but feel is the case. There's very little poetry coming out of Mecca, almost nothing from the pre-Islamic period. And there's a lot of poetry from just outside of Mecca, from all of these tribes, Sulaim, as Hudayl. And the poetic, it's not that they didn't ever write poetry in Mecca. I'm sure they probably had poetry, but it wasn't this nomadic poetry of the Arab that becomes so important later on as the sort of basis for Islamic poetry. The early poetry collectors did not like urban poetry. There's a few poets from Hira in like sort of lower Iraq, but all of the early Arabic poetry collectors like urban poets, because they were not connected to the sort of nomadic life world. So I think there is some major distinction there in the very earliest period between people who are living in cities and people who are out living a more or less fully nomadic life. And the poetry certainly revolves around, the poetry that we have revolves around this nomadic life world. And it's a pretty different one from the Quran. It's a pretty different one from, it varies a lot between different parts of the peninsula, between Najd and Hejaz, between the East and the West. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it definitely it answered my question, and I also agree. Despite Rashid Goyal's thesis, if it's correct or not correct, there's still a lot that it doesn't change, such as what did being an Arab mean pre-Islam? I believe Peter Webb's book, especially the second half of his book, demonstrates the debates that were going on early Islam on what it meant. Was it tied to geography? Was it tied to language? Obviously, before Islam, it was a bit of a nebulous term, or at least not as salient as it would become after Islam, well, Islam is emerging. So no, you answered my question. I was just curious about that. Sorry.
So you've highlighted the dangers inherent in sort of uncritically accepting a representation of early Arabic poetry as indicative of this sort of undifferentiated, homogeneous Arab culture in the pre-Islamic period. And in your book, you sort of engage in reconstructive work to sort of disaggregate the received material and reflect the more phenomenological reality of the region's culture. How did you go about that work, and sort of what historical sources in conjunction with the poetry do you use in order to reconstruct a more accurate narrative?
So the first thing that I did, and this started off in some of my articles and presentations. So the first article that I ever published was about descriptions of rain seasons in early Arabic poets. It's a 2017 article. It's in Arabica. And what I noticed, that was sort of published at the same time as I was working on my dissertation. And what I noticed first with the poetry was that I was initially going to do a study of the Hudayl tribe. And the reason why I was going to do a study of the Hudayl tribe, and they're really my main source for Hijazi poetry, was because, well, I'll tell you the story because it's the easiest way to look at it. I was working on my comprehensive exams and trying to think of a topic for my dissertation. And I knew it was going to be about early Arabic poetry. And there's this fantastic resource, which I constantly cite in my book, and I post bits of it on my Twitter account all the time for the biographers, the poet, the Routledge Encyclopedia of Arabic Literature by Julia Maysami and Paul Starkey, that just has most of the most important poets and really all the scholars that I have found most valuable for early Arabic poetry. And I was going through and I was looking at something, and I saw that there was an entry for the Hudayliyin for this tribe. And it was by Renate Jacobi, who's a pretty older German scholar, literary scholar. And she said that this basically hasn't been studied, like they haven't been evaluated yet, this tribe. And so I said, okay, well, I'll do that. And there's one famous poem by Hudayli, which is Abu Gha'ib's Marthia, which is a long poem, which is supposedly an elegy for his sons, but seems to mostly have like a lot of descriptions of hunting, like desert hunting, and the animals dying as a sort of symbol for the elegy. And a lot of people know that poem, but generally, Hudayl was apparently their collection of poems was the only tribal collection which exists up until this point. So from sources like Ibn Adim's Fihrist and that kind of thing, we know that in Abbasid Baghdad, they had all of these collections of tribal diwans. There was like a Quraysh diwan, there was a Tamim diwan, there was a Kalb diwan. There were all of these diwans of like all the poets from particular tribes that they could lay their hands on. And none of them survived for various reasons, although probably a lot of the material still survives in other collections. But I was quite drawn to this. And then it was more exciting to me when I found out that Hudayl basically lived right outside of Mecca. They have a few poems that deal with their interactions with the Meccans. And so I decided to make my dissertation a study of that. And the book is really an expansion. So let's take the lessons from that and look at all of early Arabic poetry rather than just this one tribe. But the thing I noticed is that their poetry is very different from all of the other poems that we mostly read. So what I had studied previously, and again, in something like the work of Suzanne Stepkovich, The Mute Immortals Speak, there's an enormous emphasis on the tripartite Qasida. So the typical Arabic poem is supposed to start off with a motif of the poet weeping over the abodes of the the beloved, and then talk about his camel or horse, and then talk about some tribal thing at the end. And when I went through for my dissertation, I read all of Hudayal's poetry. They have about 4,500 lines of poetry in that diwan, and I think about 1,000 to 1,500 lines of it are pre-early Islamic period. And there's not a single tripartite Qasida in there. And that sort of blew my mind that they never have a journey through the desert section, which I learned from English language secondary literature is sort of like the norm for pre-Islamic poetry. So that was the jumping off point for me, was to go through and just look through the poetry again from a regional lens and say, well, what other differences are there between these poets? And then as I was looking at that, what I noticed is that almost all of the poets, generally, if you pick up one of these canonical collections like the Mufaddaliyat or the Asma'iyat or the Mu'allaqat, all of these things that people read and refer to the most often as the most important early collections of Arabic poetry, they're almost all from Nejd, which is probably almost everyone knows where that is, but Nejd is the central plateau of Arabia. And if you read the early Islamic geographers, they just say, Nejd is everything east of the Hejaz. It's just, and you really get that sense from the Hejazis that Nejd is like, it's like the flyover states or something, what we say in the United States is like places that it's not us. And it's closer to Iraq, which was very significant for the collection of early Arabic poetry, which took place almost entirely in Basra and Kufa and Baghdad, not in Mecca and Medina or Cairo. Well, Cairo didn't exist, or in Egypt. And so I started off, the poetry was really my main source, and this is to answer your question. But I tried my best to try and correlate things to what was going on outside of the Arab world. And so this was sort of the second step. And what I found with the Nejdis was that they were much more engaged with the Persians. And then when I was looking at Hudayal's poetry, I saw no Persian words at all. I mean, there might have been one or two that I missed or something like that. And then when you look at the Nejdis, you have famous poets like Al-A'sha, who's famous for fitting like 8 Persian, like Arabized Persian words into his 3 or 4 lines of Arabic poetry. And so this was sort of the second stage, was to look at the non-Arabic or non-Arabian states that were in late antique Arabia or bordering on late antique Arabia, which is the Sasanians in Yemen and the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines. And so I started to notice, and then to look at where the tribes were actually from. People often read a pre-Islamic because of this thing of like, oh, they're all Arabs. People tend to read, especially in the West, Saudis won't do this, right? But like a British person is just like, I don't know the difference between like Tamim and Hudayl and Becker. There's several different Beckers. I can't tell the difference between Becker ibn Wa'il and the Becker that's in the Hejaz and like all these things. And so there's a very small number of scholars figure out where these people are actually. They'll read a poem and they'll say, okay, this is some pre-Islamic poet. But if you go through and you map out where these guys are from, you start to see larger differences on the basis of, oh, okay, they were near Persia. So they talk more about, they use some Persian words, or then their descriptions of wine are similar to, or they seem to be drawing on Sasanian practices, or they're referring to kinds of armor that we know from archaeology are Roman or Sasanian or something. And I started to find all of these things that, when they describe writing that they can't read, the people in the Hejaz will say, this looks like Himyarite writing. This looks like Yemeni Sabaic inscriptions. And then when you're reading a poet from Nejd, they'll say, this looks like Persian. And when you're reading a poet from the northwest, they'll say, this looks like Greek. So they're drawing on things that are not from their Arabian Arabic speaking world. And it's there in the poetry. And once you look at where the tribes are from, and you look at the geology, and you look at why geography, when you look at why the geography mattered to them, which was because of where they would go to pasture and where they would move from it to in different times of the year. And when you look at who they were interacting with when they weren't out in the desert, because they were getting weapons from somebody, they were buying wine from somebody, they were, according to all of the non-Arabic sources, some of them were converting and going to churches or shrines or monasteries. You start to see that there are a lot of differences between the different poets and the different tribes in different parts of the peninsula based on where they were located, where they were migrating, and who they were interacting with. to get their material sort of resources from. I mean, in the desert, you've got dates and milk and a few other things, but they were going to markets and participating in diplomacy and doing a lot of other stuff in order to as part of their military culture, as part of the religious culture. A lot of that's not, the religious culture is not reflected in the poetry for the most part, but so many other things are, and I just really started to see the poets as all having separate, not separate, but semi-separate cultures in the different parts of the peninsula, those were primarily the Najdi up by Persia, and then the Hijazi poets, which were around Mecca and Medina.
In order to sort of discuss this sort of regional differentiation between Najdi and Hijazi poetry and the circumstances that produce that, you use Louis Altaz's concept of interpolation to explore how sort of late antique Arabian group identity was transformed as a result of contact with the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Why did you find that concept so useful in your work, and can you explain a little bit about how you used it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when you're doing analysis of one thing or another for your dissertation, you'll have a lot of people telling you not to use the word influence because it's unidirectional, and it assumes that the person who's being influenced is sort of a receptacle for some other thing. This is actually one of the critiques of Tah Hussein back by this German in 1926, is that he was assuming that the Sabaic civilization of Yemen was superior to and should have been influencing the Arabs. And he's just basing this on the idea that nomads are inferior to people who live in cities or people who are using writing on stone.
You know, we had this conversation while we were putting together our questions when I used the term or the word influence in substitute of interpolation. Corrected me. I thought she was being a bit rigid. I thought that maybe, you know, that was a good word to interchangeably use, but she was like, no, it's totally different. And so it's funny that you brought that up.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. I don't know. It's sort of a bit of a I don't know. It can be like a lot of things that have to do with academic jargon. It can become a bit of a shibboleth thing or something. But the reason why I guess an analog to this problem, this analytic problem, is with the Quran. So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings and miscommunications that happen over what was the relationship between the early Muslims and, say, late antique Jews and Christians. Because some of the early Orientalists, the late 19th century Orientalists, definitely did see it in terms of influence. They would, latch on to this polemic about the prophet, learning the scriptures from somebody else or something, and they would say, oh, like, here's the source for this. It's rabbinic, or it's from Midrash, or whatever. Angelica Neubert, she doesn't have this view. Contemporary Quranic scholars don't see that. And they use the word dialogue a lot of the times, as it's like they're kind of having arguments back and forth between these different communities. And there's much more of an acceptance that Islam was something new socially, theologically, and that it was, out to stake out a theological position vis-a-vis the Jews and Christians. It's just that it didn't come out of nowhere. It started as being in dialogue with Jews and Christians. And so with the Arabic poets, there's very little discussion of religion in them. They seem very a-religious based on the poetry, which doesn't mean that they were a-religious, but it just means that they didn't write about religion in poetry. I also didn't want to fall into this Orientalist trap of saying, I mean, in general, I like Orientalists, but this is a bad aspect of the early Orientalism, is just sort of seeing a social or a cultural development and just as a reflex of another one, or an imitation or a poor copy. That never gets you anywhere analytically, just to leave aside the question of whether it has notions of like someone being superior to someone else. So you have the Sasanians and the Romans, and I did not want to think about it in these terms of like they're superior and they're influencing these Arabic poets. And it's really hard to actually read the Arabic poetry with that in mind, because they don't seem like poor knockoffs of a Persian or poor knockoffs of a Greek. they're very much doing their own thing, and they really are like in dialogue with some of these other concepts, like what's a king? You know, I mean, there were different ideas about what a king as a ruler should be doing in pre-Islamic Arabia. Those were those were actually, the concepts were influenced by Sasanian and Byzantine practice, but then what the actual poets are doing with it when they mention Malik, when they mention the king, is going to be very, very different. Sometimes it's in reaction to it, they'll be like, "I kill kings." You know, the poet will say, "You know, I'm that fierce of a warrior that someone who calls themselves Malik, I kill them in battle. I win, even though I'm not a king." Other people are boasting about it. They're saying, you know, I go and I hang out with Muluk, I hang out with kings. They're envisioning maybe like one of these, like the Lachmids or the Ghasanids, one of these Arabic-speaking groups that were definitely interacting a lot with the Persians. So Althusser, I learned about when I was in English graduate school, and I sort of liked this idea because he uses this notion of interpolation. So in French, interpeller can mean either to bring someone in for a police interrogation, which he quite liked. He's like a 1960s French Marxist. So he wants to keep the police. And then it can also mean to just call someone, like to say, hey, you know, you were there. And so he drew on these two notions of like being kind of being spoken to, being in dialogue, but there's also sort of a power relationship between the two things. And someone who is interpolated for him by ideology is someone who receives messages about like how society should work from in his case, he's thinking of like the press or universities or something, that are telling us, you know, what we're supposed to be as individuals. And then, you know, we're not influenced by the way, we don't just like suck it all up and turn into exactly model citizens that we're supposed to be based on what we're told to be by the police or the media or something. We create our own subjectivities in his terms, either by reacting to it, by creating our own cultures, by creating subcultures. There's a lot of different possible responses to, you know, sort of what's the ideal way to be in a society, and then how individuals respond to that. And so as I was wrestling to not use the term influence in my book, I plucked this out as being the best possible alternative, even though I think it looks a bit weird in the context of this book. Althusser comes up a lot in English literary studies and in a lot of fields. He doesn't come up very often in Islamic studies. And he has a lot of limitations as a thinker as well that that I didn't want to bring in with the book, but I thought it was a good jumping off place just to sort of establish that we're not talking about Arabic poets that are trying to copy the Persians or being influenced by the Greeks or something like that, but they're creating this poetry. It's, you know, it's being given shape in dialogue in the relationship with these states, which in some ways were much more powerful than them, but that in other ways they were really antagonistic to it. In other ways were quite weak. I mean, they something like Sasanian Persia, everyone knew that these empires had weaknesses because of the wars that had been going on between them right up into the run-up to Islam, which is referenced famously in Surat al-Rum, about the Byzantines are going to win this battle, and maybe refers to the Sasanian conquest of Jerusalem. That's getting off onto a bit of a tangent, but they were not necessarily seen as all-powerful emperors by nomads or even by anybody in the Near East at that time. So I wanted to avoid this idea that they were just influencing in a unidirectional way the Arabic tribes.
I mean, it was a very useful term to keep in mind as I was reading the book. I mean, I found it to be very helpful. I mean, you also mentioned another anthropological concept of heterarchy. Can you explain this concept's role in Najdi and Hijazi poetry's public performance?
Yeah, so this is a term from, let's see here. actually, I don't know these anthropologists very well. I think it's Carol Brumley, and someone else. Sorry, Elizabeth Broomfield, and or the name of the other scholar. So yeah, and I was this was pointed out to me by Sana Sfard. She was at the University of Helsinki, I think, at the time, and I published an article in a book that she was editing, and she's an archaeologist of much more older Near Eastern stuff, and it really helped me clarify that that book chapter back when we were doing this, and then I decided to keep it for the book. But how I use it, and yeah, this is very connected to not talking about influences, that these poets, when you're looking at the poetry, they're just all boasting all of the time. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of fronting in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. And so, and there's apparently a lot of violence. I mean, I do kind of suspect that there was less actual violence in pre-Islamic Arabia than we would get the impression from the poets. I mean, they just have horrific descriptions of brutality in some of their poetry. But at the same time, modern ethnographers have sort of said, oh, I went to Yemen or something in the whatever, in the 60s or the 1890s or whatever, and it isn't actually that violent. There's just a lot of rhetorical performance of violence.
It was more like sport. Maybe that might not be the right word to use, but there was never no intention of actually killing or exterminating tribes in mass. It was more of a show of dominance.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it could be. I think they were always willing to be much more violent than. So every human is willing to use violence. This is the thing, is that the big distinguishing feature between, this is the equivalent for the political equivalent of what I was talking about before in nature and romanticism, I think, is like the state's monopoly on violence. Right now, I think the idea of being nonviolent, a lot of that is underwritten by the fact that we as modern people think that the state should have a monopoly on violence. And so when we say, oh, we shouldn't fight or something, the implication is that the police or the state should take care of that rather than individuals, which I'm not, and I'm just saying this as an intellectual history point. I'm not saying people should go out and, but I'm saying this is the framework that we operate on. And in pre-Islamic Arabia, there was literally no state to have recourse to. So I think that they probably were willing to get violent quite a lot of the time. But I do think they also had a very keen awareness that was, that the diplomacy was also a thing, and a lot of the same things that could be accomplished, just like this is the same thing in modern political science or something, a lot of the same things that can be accomplished through violence can also be accomplished through diplomacy or cultural superiority or like soft power or something like that. So I think that they functioned the same way that all humans do in a political world where violence was an option. But it's often not a very effective or efficient option because people get killed, you might lose, there's risks. So I don't think they were like psychos that were just going around slaughtering each other all the time, which is sometimes the impression that you can get. I do think they were more violent than we would be comfortable with. Yeah, so heterarchy. In a heterarchical system, anthropologists have used this to explain where there's more than one hierarchy. So you have groups of tribes. There's definitely certain families or elites that were in charge of certain tribes. And then there were definitely tribes that were more powerful than others. And then also these states like the Persians that they had to interact with were more powerful than them in a lot of ways. And so, but they, you really don't see very much language of like acknowledgement of this hierarchy in the poetry. It's much more, what you see much more often is a willingness to assert that they'll use violence, even if it's not their first option. There's a, constant boasting about the superiority of one's lineage against everybody else. There's you do see it sometimes, but you very frequently see a poet saying, I have an inferior lineage, I'm inferior, I'm subordinated to some other. There's a famous poem that's like the first one in Al-Tamam's Hamasa, which is someone complaining about how the fact that they're from a powerless tribe and that they get treated badly. So you do see this acknowledgement occasionally, but But for the poets, I think most of the time their job was to assert superiority over any number of other individuals or groups. So in a heterarchy, you have actually you have superiority. It's there, but one definition of it is that the people that have different value systems in their own group have to interact as equals with another group, which might have their own set of hierarchies. So like a simple example of that would be like if there's two tribes and maybe they'll have a war, and maybe they won't, and one of them, they both think that they're better than the other, and neither one wants to acknowledge that. And maybe there is some element that is forcing one of them to take a subordinate position for some reason. They have a disagreement about where they're going to pasture, or how to resolve like a murder or blood white situation or something. So what the poets are often doing is they'll come together, and there seems to have been some sort of scenarios where they were performing poetry publicly in front of each other. And the poet's job will sort of be to not lose face in the eyes of the other tribe, but also to acknowledge maybe something like a concession. So it's really a diplomatic role, essentially. And so heterarchy was a good term for just describing this, where you see these poems, and there's one, I think the longest one that I talk about in my book is by Anabaha of Viviani. And again, this is one of those things where people will tend to read it and they'll be like, tribal stuff. These people are like fighting with each other. There's these guys boasting. It's just typical Jahili bickering and whatever. But I actually see it as quite sophisticated diplomacy. And the poems that I talk about in the book, they're really, you read them and you do come away with a sense that, okay, this is coming from an important group. Like you don't feel like but then when you look at it more carefully, you're like, oh, they are making concessions. And yeah, they're saying we're going to fight a battle or something, but they're actually, that comes at the end after they've already made the concession. And that maybe they're using the image of the battle to balance out this concession that they had to make about paying a blood white or something, paying the dia, the camels that you have to pay if someone's been murdered. They would have negotiations about that. How many camels do we owe for someone being slain? So everything was up for negotiation, and the poetry really helped them do that. And no one wanted to subordinate themselves to someone else. They all had their sense of hierarchy, their place in the world. But it was constantly shifting. Things could change overnight if the weather was bad and there weren't rains, or if there was some sort of military intervention from the Persians or from Yemen. So they had to deal with the situation where they were constantly in negotiation with other groups, and poetry really helped them massage that so that they retained as high a status as possible with the other groups that they were interacting with, at the same time as they were smoothing the relationship one way or another, or paving the way for a battle if they found that there was something irreconcilable.
You definitely do see that in the poetry, that it seems to start off with some kind of appeal for diplomacy, and then ends with, if it doesn't go that way, I'm just paraphrasing, I'm the toughest fighter from Hideo, to show like, if I don't get my way, I'm willing to take things in a different direction, just as capable. You discuss how early Arabian ethics centered on the value of muruwa, if I'm saying that correctly. Its focus on the personality and body of the elite male leader. How did embodied representations and assertions of this value differ in Najdi and Hijazi poetry?
So this was like, basically a couple of my chapters ended up being largely about gender. I mean, this is how we would describe it in sort of modern academic terms, which actually wasn't what I set out to do, but I found that it was a very, it's a salient lens with which to look at the issue. And as I was doing that, so there's a lot of arguments about al-muruwa or al-muru'a in Western scholarship as trying to understand early Arabic poetry. So the first person to write extensively about this was the Hungarian Orientalist Ignaz Koltzai in the late 19th century. And his basic observation, which is it's correct, is that he was reading pre-Islamic poetry and he said this is all boasting. This is like everything is a boast. They don't describe nature, they boast about how they control nature. They don't describe the beloved, they boast about how like they're, you know, sleeping with this woman or something, or how they are cuckolding another guy. They're not describing their camel, they're boasting about how awesome their camel is. They're not describing their horse, they're boasting about how awesome their horse is, and that's because they're a great, you know, a great hunter. And then there's the straightforward boasting, which is like boasting about how good you are in fighting, boasting about how good you are, how powerful of a tribe you are, boasting about how respected and how good of an orator you are. So Goldsire said that basically, and actually I think I might be synthesizing a couple of him with another German scholar, but within that sort of German scholarly tradition, there's this sort of analytic framework of saying this is all about Moru'a. Moru'a is just the term for like, you see in the poetry itself, which is something I like about this analysis, is that it's drawing on the terms the poetry itself is actually using, is a very important value for these people. It's like chivalry, it's like masculinity, and it's a whole ethical thing. And it's very similar to like people as classicists have written about in ancient Rome. You know, being virtuous was very connected to being virile. Being a proper male was very connected to being a good citizen, to having correct ethics, to having correct comportment in a number of ways. And it's a very, not entirely, but very patriarchal society. So it's a really salient feature of the poetry that they're talking about what it means to be a man. And so that was kind of Goldsire's analysis. Again, James Montgomery has sort of written about this as a big thing. The problem with this way of thinking about things is that it suddenly does just reduce all of the poetry to boasting, like just sort of in the description that I just gave you. It's like, okay, well, how do we read anything as anything other than boasting? All I have to do is pick up a pre-Islamic poem and be like, boast, 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 Moru'a, Moru'a, Moru'a. And so what I tried to do in the book is talk about the different modes of, like, I guess, being an elite male. And one of the things that is sort of a virtue and a problem of the poetry is that it all starts off with these conversations with female figures, with women, with beloved. Sometimes there's like, there's a couple of interesting ones versus a wife or a daughter or something. So a typical example, which is, I like quite a bit from the book, I can dig it up, but there's this poet who is getting into an argument with his wife because he has a horse and he's spending too much on the horse. And the wife wants him to spend more money on the family. And something that you see quite frequently is that, I don't know about the details of this because I'm not a horse, I don't know, not a rancher. But they would give the horses camel milk. Horses don't survive well in the desert. And so they would give them camel milk to keep, you know, for nutrition. Sometimes the poets refer to keeping them in their tent because they needed to keep them warm. Horses were finicky about staying out in the cold and that kind of thing. But they were important for military purposes. And a little thing that I found in the Syria that I thought was neat that's in the book is that mounted fighters in one of the early Muslim agreements that's mentioned in the Syria would receive a much larger portion of the spoils from a battle than the footmen. And that was justified by the cost of maintaining a horse. So to return to this guy and his wife, this poet is having this discussion about he starts off his poem, which is basically a horse description, with this argument with his wife. And almost every Arabic poem starts off with, pre-Islamic Arabic poem starts off with some male poet trying to relate to a woman in his life in one way or another. And so there's, you know, she's gone, I can see her campsite, I'm crying over it. There's like a sort of boast one where it's like, I'm going to spend money on wine and fighting because you only live once. That's like something that you see in Parha quite a bit. So you women who are scolding me, sometimes they're not even like described in detail, but they'll just be like a generic word, like Adala is like the reproacher, or La'ima. It's just like some female that is complaining about how much he's spending. So as I was looking through this material, what I started to notice, the same thing as I noticed as I was talking about earlier, that you start to notice different kinds of references to the Persians and to the Greeks and that kind of thing in different parts of the peninsula, is that not necessarily these little stock scenarios, these little dialogues, because they're not very realistic, other than that thing about keeping the horse in the tent. Most of them aren't very realistic, and the women don't really have any real agency in the poetry. It's really just, it's this one-sided monologue from the male poet's perspective. So that's the sort of drawback from this gender lens. But what I did notice is that the role that this sort of these female characters would play for poets varied a lot from place to place. And I think this was something that I really struggled with, because it wasn't such a clear cut. It's not as clear cut as some of the other issues that I came up with in the book. But a lot of the conversations revolve around what I was just talking about spending, about finances, family finances, tribal finances. And so a lot of these female characters in the poems are actually vehicles for the male to talk about how, the male poet to talk about how they're sort of in control over some aspect of financial or social status. So to return to this example of the guy who's getting into the argument with his wife about whether or not to keep the horse in the tent, whether or not to give it the camel's milk, he wins that fight because he's the poet. He's having the final say, and he just describes how wonderful his horse is, and then there's a horse description. And so a lot of the times, the address to the female character is a way for the poet to talk about his social role. I am, a horse. I fight with a horse. I have a horse. This is part of my identity, and this is part of what makes me a good leader and a good member of my tribe, and that kind of thing. When I was reading Hudhail's poetry, again, we're back in southern Hejaz near Mecca. A lot of these guys don't have horses. They don't seem to have a lot of resources to spend. And it seems to be because the economy there was less developed than up on the frontier regions with the empires, with the Romans and the Sasanians. So they'll be getting into arguments with their wife or their significant other or something. And it winds up as being, I don't need to spend money on anything. I don't need anything to survive. I walk through the desert. I don't have a horse. I run through the desert. I don't need sandals. My sandals fall off when I keep walking. I don't need any food. I'm skinny as an arrow. I'm skinny as a spear. There's a lot of this kind of description, which is very different from in Nejd, where they're like, I have a horse. I'm spending so much on wine. I can't count how much wine I've had to drink, which was a very expensive commodity at that time. You didn't have box wine back then. So I saw that the way the poets were talking about what it meant for them to be members of their tribe, members of their society, was to be an ethical person, to be someone who's of value to their society as a fighter and as an individual, was very connected to masculinity, and the poetry allowed them to sort of present a public image to themselves, and they use these dialogues with, to a large extent, imagined female interlocutors that they're talking with as a way of doing this, and that this actually works very differently in different parts of the peninsula. So yes, maybe it is all about Marua, because it was just a very being a proper man was a central part to this kind of society, where there was effectively no state, and everyone had to be able to fight and negotiate over who wins and who loses. But how you do that varies a lot from poet to poet and from place to place in different parts of the Arabian Peninsula.
You've already mentioned sort of that a lot of this poetry lacks any religious sentiment, whether monotheistic or polytheistic. But in terms of references to ritual, what references exist to sort of the Meccan Hajj and Umrah in both sort of Najdi and Hijazi poetry, and what can the presence or absence of that tell us about the social and religious significance of this ritual and Mecca itself in antique Arabia? So one of the issues that people wanted to find was
there's a lot of interesting things really. Scholars for a long time have looked for evidence of polytheism in the poets in the first place, and there isn't very much. There is there's occasional a couple of things that are in Hudayal's poetry that are quite interesting, are not necessarily references to kind of what we would think of as polytheism, like I'm gonna sacrifice some animal for this named deity at this particular shrine somewhere, but they're more kind of glancing references. So the famous poet Abu Dhawaib that I mentioned, supposedly his teacher was this guy named Sa'd ibn Ju'ayya, who, so that must have been, if that was correct, and his poetry seems to look like this, it's a little bit like late pre-Islamic, like there doesn't seem to be any reports of him being alive at the time of Islam. But he has an oath where he seems to be referring to the Meccan Hajj, but he says by the legs of these camels that are, that's his oath. He's like swearing that. And As-Sukari, the commentator who preserves this poem, says, so this is not a good oath, because he's swearing by something created. He's not swearing by God or even by like a lesser deity. He's swearing by animal legs. And so in a few places you see a few references, the fact that they're living in a world where the Hajj is, so in the first place, one of the things I see in Hudayl is that they were going to Arafat. They don't seem to be going on Hajj to the Kaaba very often. And the camel sacrifice is associated with going to Arafat, not with going to into Mecca, to going around the Kaaba. And there was this argument by, again, Julius Wellhausen, German guy, that the Umrah, the Meccan Umrah around the Kaaba and the circumambulation of it was a separate ritual in pre-Islamic times from the Wuquf on Arafat, which was, and it's a very interesting point, because even today, the Haram around Mecca doesn't include Arafat's outside of the Haram, and that's kind of a weird quirk, really, if you think about it. If these things are two separate rituals, then you would think everything would be taking place within the Haram. And so I think the Prophet and the early Muslims obviously reformed the Hajj and all of the rituals associated with it, and perhaps merged the Hajj and the Umrah into one more or less similar thing, and gave Umrah a new definition, and then made the Hajj include both the stuff happening in Mina and Arafat, and then also the stuff happening in the city itself around the Kaaba. But the poets around Hejaz refer fairly often to camel sacrifice. They refer fairly often, it seems, to stuff happening around Arafat. And they don't refer to the Kaaba very, very much. I do start off the book with a guy who is a story about Abu Jundab, who makes a trip to the Kaaba, but he's going there to swear vengeance against his enemy. He's not going there seemingly as a religious practice. He doesn't sacrifice anything when he goes there. He just goes there and sorry?
Oh, he goes there to make an oath.
Yeah, he just goes there to recite this poem about how he's going to kill someone who killed his friends. Which according to the story, he successfully did. So you see this with Hudayl, and you see these glancing references to polytheism kind of in a few other contexts. And what the Islamic sources themselves say is that there were other shrines around Arabia. And so I have like one poem, for example, that I discuss in the book, where the poet's describing a pilgrimage, but the terms that he's using, none of them fit with any of the terminology for the Meccan pilgrimage. And so it's been interpreted as something that's about someone who's from Najd, someone who's from Tamim, which is again up in the northeast of the peninsula, going to but if you look at the terminology, it seems like it's referring to another shrine. It doesn't seem like it's referring to the Meccan shrine. And the general image that you get from the poets is that Mecca was not very important to them. Even Hudayl, And this is a thing that I think is striking, and I think most really historically have been a salient, sort of more or less real thing, because as Tah Hussein said, right, a lot of later poetry was forged in order to, or rewritten or pseudo-epigraphically composed, however you want to phrase it, in the service of Islamic era political agendas. And so if someone wanted to do it, they could do it. You can really tell a difference very easily between a poet who's making all sorts of crazy boasts about their connection to pre-Islamic Mecca and Quraysh, and it sounds like just totally made up, and then poets who are like this poem in the book by this Tamimi who's describing a pilgrimage. It really has an air of authenticity to it because the terminology he's using doesn't match up with the Islamic Hajj. He's not near Mecca as a poet, so it wouldn't make sense for him to be going there. And so you do find these places every now and again. Hudayl has some poems where they're sort of belittling apparently Meccans. So like they refer a couple of times to Meccan women, and rather than calling them someone from Quraysh or something, they're called Hermiya, which seems to be a term from someone who comes from within the Haram. And in both cases, they're not, there's just kind of like generic misogynistic description of women. One of them's like screaming for no reason, and the other one is like getting in the way of the poet's camel and trying to sell him something. And so even the poets who were near Mecca, it doesn't seem to have been very significant for them. And again, this is only one slice of, I'm not saying this is the entire representation of everything. My book's about poetry, and I'm trying to sort of bring this as an additional image into the discussion of early Islamic history. It's not the entire picture. It could have been that they had I'm sure that they did have very significant relationships with the closest city to them that probably just didn't get discussed in poetry. But on the basis of the poetry, Mecca was not an important city. Quraysh was not an important tribe. Doing circumambulation around the Kaaba didn't matter to them. And they were not very religious. So that's the image that you get from pretty much everyone. And that's the image that you get from the people who live near Mecca. The people who didn't live near Mecca really didn't seem to care about Mecca or Quraysh or anything like that. So I think there's this older image, certainly in Western scholarship, and I think it has sort of a mixed basis in the Islamic sources, that Mecca was this really important city. Quraysh was really widely respected all around Arabia before the advent of Islam. And I think, again, to return to Tah Hussein, I think that broadly speaking, he was right, that there is a lot of material that was composed and ascribed to the pre-Islamic period later that makes it seem like Mecca and Quraysh were super important in the pre-Islamic period. But I think really what gave them their status was the emergence of Islam. I mean, on the available evidence from what I can see is that Quraysh was the main tribe in Mecca, but it wasn't some sort of widely respected tribe amongst all Arabs all over the Arabian Peninsula. And Mecca was an important regional center, but it was not some giant cosmopolitan trade powerhouse where everyone from Arabia was going there, on a yearly basis in order to do their business or whatever. I think the people in other parts of Arabia were going to, it just makes sense why, if you've got Ctesiphon, the capital of the Sasanian Empire, a 1 week trip from where you pasture, why would you go to Mecca rather than going there if you want to sell your camels or buy some weapons or something?
Right.
Just to circle back to what you said at the very beginning about nature and its meaning within this poetry. You state that for early Arabic poetry, no nature precedes its social meaning. So can you explain exactly what you sort of meant by this in a bit more detail, and how it relates to the local ecologies and lived geographies that were depicted very differentially in sort of Najdi and Hijazi poetry?
Yeah. So the thing, I sort of mentioned this a little bit with the Morua as well. And the one thing that sort of made this click for me, I got a bit of an obsession with German scholarship, as you guys are probably telling. I would recommend anyone who's thinking of doing a PhD, my first recommendation would be don't do a PhD in early Arabic poetry, just do it in computer science and AI. But after that, if someone still insisted on doing it, I would say that it's very important to read the German scholarship. There's a lot more better stuff. It's not because Germans are like inherently better at it or anything. I think that there's just a lot of translations in German, and there's a body of scholarship there that developed, which is was very useful to me. So Gregor Scholler, who has actually a lot of his recent stuff has been translated, and he's much more well known now for talking about oral knowledge in early Islamic history, and how really knowledge was based on oral transmission in early rather than written transmission. But his first book was about nature in Arabic poetry. And so he has a description, which I think I actually basically copied this in my book with a citation, of a poet who is describing a pasture. And Scholler's analysis of this is that the description of the pasture, there's flies, there's the different kinds of plants that are growing, there's like how wet it is, there's its elevation, there's a bunch of little naturalistic details. And Scholler's analysis of it is that this is basically an assertion of power. It's an assertion of his ability to control it. And if you read the passage, you say, okay, let's connect it to a horse description. You know, he didn't walk to this pasture on a hike. He rode there, and you have to have money and power to have a horse to ride around. And he says explicitly, the poet says explicitly, you know, no one else pastures here. We pasture here. So he's describing the details of this, not, you know, the way that I was, or still read, you know, a lot of us want to read poetry as like, oh man, I hate being in the city. I want to read a poem about rivers and stuff. But he's describing it as, this is something that we have control over. This is something that we prohibit other tribes from accessing, because it's a good place to pasture. It's got good vegetation for feeding the camels. Camels are wealth. I mean, the word mal literally means both money and camels in early Arabic. And so it's the main economic resource for this tribe. So when he describes it, it's really a very different, you know, I might read it and sort of be able to visualize this pasture that he's describing. And there's these cool, you know, I mean, this is something else again, if you want to follow some of these people from Saudi or other Arab, like peninsular countries, you know, posting images of the vegetation that grows when it rains in different parts of Saudi, and then next to quotations from the early poets. They know what they're talking about. They are accurately describing, you know, plants that are still there, geological features that are still there, the wadis, the water, everything like that. They're experts in it. But for them, it was a matter of you know, controlling an economic resource. And this is not any different today, really. I mean, you know, we've completely commodified nature. Anytime that you want to access nature, you have to pay for it now to go on a vacation somewhere, or buy a house that costs $2 million in Boulder, Colorado. And then you get your access to nature. And so we're not having an unmediated relationship with it now either. The ability to go out, experience nature, and feel refreshed and everything is very connected to other kinds of societal resources, education and money and occupation and that kind of thing. So it was the same thing for them. And so that's really what I became aware of and wanted to sort of highlight as it's not nature poetry, not the way that we typically think of it.
And how was poetry pivotal in the Umayyad project, constructing Quraysh as a cohesive, sacral, kin-based social unit that could serve as a model against which other tribes and religious groups would position themselves?
So I felt those are all terms from my book, and when you sort of when I hear them in the form of a question, I'm like, oh wow, I could have used some more straightforward language to describe what I'm talking about. So Quraysh does take over, right? This is again with Tah Hussein, they do take over, and the poetry does become all about Quraysh. Again, that's something that he's not wrong about. During the Umayyad period, it's all about them. And the big picture is that they were fighting each other within that tribe like just cats and dogs. I mean, it's just insane. You read early Arabic, early Islamic history, and the fitna, the first civil war, the second fitna, the
It's an excellent drama.
Yeah. So then you read these poems that are for court performance before the caliph, and they're like, you know, Quraysh is the most generous tribe. Quraysh is the one that's closest to the prophet. Quraysh is the one that is our salvation. Quraysh is this. And you're like, this isn't reality. This is not the way that it was really working on the ground. This is definitely an ideological image. And, you know, good job, Quraysh. You know, they managed to create that. And the poets helped them. And so that's there. Tah Hussein was totally right about that. It just happens in the Umayyad period, not during the Jahiliyyah period. Mm. And so the book goes through and maps out, in the first place, my obsession being with Hijazi poets, with the ones who are from the area where Islam actually emerged, Mecca and Medina. As I was saying, in the pre-Islamic period, they didn't seem to care about Quraysh at all. But you go 50 years into Islam and they suddenly do care quite a bit, which isn't surprising because they want to go to court and get paid by the caliph to recite some poetry and also, you know, help smooth over whatever relationships they have with their tribe in terms of how much they're getting paid or taxed or whatever. Well, they weren't taxed, the Arabs weren't taxed at all, but how much they were getting paid from the Diwan, from the military register, and or to help them resolve them. And so you see this really, if you just read the Umayyad poetry, the second part of the book, the last part of my book, my third part of my book, is how did this happen? How did the Hijazis go from not really caring about Quraysh to basically, well, the Arab poets in general, how do they go from not caring about Quraysh to sort of being this tribe's champion? And obviously Islam is the main reason, but even you know, even in a system where you admittedly get paid to write poetry, it seems it's a bit more complicated than that, right? You don't just say, okay, well, suddenly I like Quraysh the way that some of our politicians comparison them to Hitler, and then 2 years later they're the vice presidential candidate. But it was kind of like that for these poets. They some of them had very bad relationships with Quraysh. They fought against them in the wars of apostasy, the Ridda Wars. They had hijat written against they had invective written against early Islamic leaders like Abu Bakr, apparently. So if the caliph is going to patronize a poet, why is he going to pick someone from one of these tribes rather than someone that was actually, you know, from Mecca and Medina? Why not just get all Qurayshi poets, for example? Why not get all poets from Medina? So the Quraysh and the poets create, you know, together. And there's other factors to this as well. I mean, there's the construction of palaces. There's, you know, caliphal patronage of hadith scholarship. There's the, you know, distribution of the Qurans, the editing of the first Musaf, the automatic thing. So there's a lot going on. It's not just about poetry, as with everything, but the poets play a really important role in this. So this is something that you do see acknowledged occasionally, like, for example, Martin Hens's and Patricia Crona's book, God's Caliph, uses a lot of poetry, which is all from Martin Hines. He was the poetry expert. One of my gripes with Patricia Crona is that she never seems to read poetry at all. Never did read poetry. But yeah, so you have this situation. I can answer this in more detail in further questions if you want, but basically, by the end of the Umayyad period, the poets are able to sort of go to the caliph or another regional leader and describe how great Quraysh is in poetry. And I think what happens is that the poets are often, when they're doing that, they're often saying, I'm related to you in some way. You know, they'll be saying, we are both Arabs. We are part of the prophet's kin. Like, I, the poet, and my tribe, Tamim, are of the prophet's kin because we're all Arabs. And here's why Quraysh is at the top of the Arabs, and here's why Quraysh is so perfect. And so when you have that kind of exchange, they both benefit. And this is what all of the Arab poets learn how to do, which is very smart in a way, is that they rather than relying on their pre-Islamic genealogies, they start to think of themselves as all Arabs and as Islam as being their religion, which sets them apart from the Nabateans that they're living with, these Aramaic speakers, the Persians, all these other people. They're a minority in this new empire with a new religion that's being, being given shape by them. And so they're able to go to Damascus or wherever the caliph is, he moving around a lot, and or other provincial leaders in Medina or in Fustat in Egypt or wherever, where another Umayyad was ruling things, and where they're all creating this idea of Quraysh as the super tribe. The poets are able to go there and paint this beautiful image of Quraysh and how important they are for Islamic theology, at the same time as they're relating their tribe to that leadership, to that Islamically legitimate leadership, through images of Arabness. And this it worked out best for all parties in a very interesting way. So the last third of my book was, okay, what happened to the Hijazis? Because initially the caliphs mostly patronized local tribes from the Hejaz. That is what they did originally. But then all of the Arab poets kind of jumped into this, jumped on the bandwagon.
And you said at first they sponsored local poets, but then other poets jumped on the bandwagon. Why did this patronage shift? I believe at first it was specifically Neo-Hijazi poets, but then the Umayyad dynasty chose Neo-Najdi poets after the Second War. So what was the impetus between the shift in patronage?
Yeah, so this is very connected to early Islamic history. So, you have the first four caliphs, a couple of assassinations, Ali ibn Abi Talib taking over, and then the civil war between him and Muawiyah, the first one. And so I got a lot of inspiration from this one essay by Hugh Kennedy about the sort of East-West polarization in the Umayyad period. That resulted from that civil war, because Ali's power base was in Iraq and Muawiyah's was in Syria. And you see all throughout the period, this is like in At-Tabari and that kind of stuff, a lot of griping about Ahl Sham. And what Ahl Sham is it's supposedly like the people of Syria, the people of the Levant, whatever, but it's actually Syrian military units, which are tribes like Kalb. That then got stationed around different parts of the Islamic world to keep the peace. So they got stationed in Iraq. And then the thing basically repeats itself during the Second Civil War. It's basically like an East-West fight. Mossad ibn Zubair controls Iraq. Abdallah, the only difference is that the Hejaz is initially in the hands of the rebels. And the Umayyads are in Syria and Egypt. So there's this East-West thing, and the before the Second Civil War, from before about the year 692, the poetry evidence is very spotty. It like really kind of gets very either the poetry that we have gets sort of made up looking, or it's just not there from that time period. It's kind of an interesting thing that I think doesn't get pointed out often enough, that I really noticed when I tried to look into it more carefully. So trying to find out what court poetry looked like, say between like 632 and 692 is actually really tricky. But part of my conclusion was that there must not be very much of it. But what there is, the tribes that are composing poetry for the Caliph in Damascus and other parts of Jerusalem, wherever he was that day, are from tribes like, two of them are live in Kalb, which are both Christian tribes during this time period. And these are the Ahl Hashem that we see in the chronicles as being bastards a lot of the time. But someone who's basically like an Iraqi will be writing about how Ahl Hashem are like, treating the civilians badly, or taking all of the money, or this, that, or the other thing. So the same tribes, the same groups in Syria that the caliphs were originally relying on before the Second Civil War were the same ones that the poets, they seem to be getting the same poets from the same tribes. And they're writing about very Hijazi-oriented themes. They're writing about the Hajj much more so than pre-Islamic poets. Suddenly now, this is why I call it neo-Hijazi. Sometimes you suddenly see a lot of description of the Hajj, and I call it neo-Hijazi because there are descriptions of the Hajj in the pre-Islamic period. It's just not actually about the Kaaba. But now, in the early Umayyad period, they're describing the Kaaba. And Umar ibn Abi Rabi'a, who's from Quraysh, is the most famous example of this. He seems to be quite early. He's not really writing panegyric, like praise for the caliphs. He's writing love poetry, but he's writing in detail about the experience of being from Mecca and these romantic scenarios, and he's drawing quite clearly also on Hudayl and other Hijazi poets. Like this was sort of something he's continued and updated to the Islamic period. When the Second Civil War happens, then that's after that when we really start to see some of the most famous Umayyad period poets. So this was really became one of the most famous Umayyad poetic texts is the Naqa'id of Jarir and Farazdaq. And so Jarir and Farazdaq are the two most famous Umayyad poets probably. And they have this Naqa'id where they're insulting each other. And I still haven't wrapped my head around that because they're both from Tamim. And one of the things that people are always saying is this is a pre-Islamic practice for the poets to insult each other. And actually, it doesn't really seem to be. I found very little of this invective between poets. It's like super obscene stuff also as well. They just like have horrific things to say about the women of the other guy's tribe. And one of the people who gets involved in this is Al-Akhtal, who's from Taghlib, who's from Syria, is a Christian, very famously very Christian poet. And official court poet of the Umayyads. And they don't hold back when they're attacking him. They're like, you're a wine drinking, pork eating Christian, and going around spilling wine all over yourself, trying to, a big cross or something like that, trying to make like you're a monk or whatever. They're always just like trashing people in Christian. My reading of this scenario is that the poets are sort of, you see this in a lot of situations where there's a sort of a group of people who could either be closer to the elite or sort of drop down into a lower level of society. And then they fight with each other for status as to whether or not they're, they're all kind of in the middle class, but are they upper middle class or lower middle class? And they fight with each other rather than with the elites in order to clarify their position. So Jarir and Farazdaq are from Tamim, they're from Najd, they have connections to Iraq, they're from the losing part of the Civil War. They are tribes that have a really spotty early history with Islam, probably participating in the Ridda and the apostasy wars. No early converts, no Sahaba, just very, very bad Islamic credentials. After the Second Civil War, they're fighting with Al-Akhtal and with other Christian poets, with Syrian poets. To a certain extent, this isn't the entire story, but they're fighting with them to move themselves closer to the Caliph. And these are the people who also have a lot of poetry for court performance for the Caliph, for other Islamic elite members, which is tripartite, which is very, very deserty, very, what we think of as an early Arabic, early Islamic Qasida, 3 nice parts, very aesthetically refined, ending with praise of the Caliph, but also including like a lot of boasts about their tribe, about Tamim, about how they're close to Quraysh, because they're all Arabs, they're all from the Prophet's lineage ultimately. And so these are the sort of neo-Hijazi and neo-Najdi things. I think during the Umayyad periods, you can still recognize the poets as drawing on regional stylistic traditions from the pre-Islamic period. But it's the Najdis who win. It's actually not the Hijazis, even though that's where Islam is from. The poets who create a more compelling, and this is like, just to like take these examples, if you look at Umar ibn Abi Rabi'a, he's remembered as like a love poet. We don't remember any like major Hijazi exist. Their poetry wasn't very well transmitted, because that process of forgetting them had already happened in the Abbasid period. Whereas when we think of Umayyad poets, we think of Tamimi poets, these ones who are actually not from Mecca or Medina, or like who had good early Islamic credentials, but those were the ones that were actually able to come up with a really nice model for how to go and praise a caliph, how to give a good poetry performance in court about the desert, strangely enough. But that was their success after the Second Civil War, was to develop this poetry, which became sort of the norm, in which the Iraqi collectors really liked and collected a lot of. They really liked Duran and Farelstock. They've got very good recensions of them compared to like I don't know, like a poet like Jamil Bethena seems to have a historical reality to him, but his poetry is a mess because it didn't get curated carefully. You know, he's from Hejaz, he's composing poetry all over the place, but a lot of it's in Egypt, you know, and the early Islamic scholars didn't take good, there's a lot of material, but they didn't take good care of it the way they did with Jabir and Farel stuff. You can really tell that they like knew Farelstock's son and stuff like that. It was like a close relationship.
I feel like your book is partly the story of how sort of the Najdi Qasida sort of is consistently able to supersede its like immediate historical circumstances and survive. You like what do you think was so unique about its capacity not only to negotiate sort of the Heterarchy prior to Islam, but then to do it during the Umayyad period, and then to have unique staying power and dominance as a poetic form after the demise of the Umayyads into the Abbasids? What was it about this form that was so essential to its survival?
I wrote some notes down here. I can't remember. I can't read my own handwriting. Constant problem of scholars. There were so many things going on. I think that I mean, I think part of this is like sort of what Peter Webb would say is that he always uses the term ethnogenesis, or I don't know. I mean, you could say like the invention of the Arabs. I'm not sure if I really would use that term, but that becoming a salient category, let's say the invention of Arabs as a category or something, is obviously a hugely important development, and the poets play a really big role in that. And the structure of the tripartite Qasida, the Najdi Qasida, is so closely linked to the content, which is all imagery of Bedouin nomadic life. And so many of the things that they're talking about, how to be, you know, an expert equestrian, horseman, warrior, what life is like in the desert, taking this journey from the desert into the, you know, to the caliph's palace that they describe they use that structure they turn it into a little story, you know, the nomad going to the caliph's palace to deliver panegyric to the legitimate leader. So I think that unity of form and content that they accomplish is hugely significant, at the same time as there's an Islamic culture emerging, and it's an Arabic culture. And there's just no question about that. This is one of the astonishing things about historians are always like thinking about all of these, comparing different forms of empires. But I mean, like, it's always so fascinating to look at the Mongols, you know, take over all of the Islamic world, basically, except for Egypt. And nobody gets influenced by Mongol culture. The Mongols all convert to Islam. They all learn Persian. And when I mean, if you know, this sounds like it is either absurd or sacrilegious, but if you bracket Islam for a second, it's kind of astonishing that these Arabians go and take over this massive expanse, and everybody like Arabizes. And there's a few different, you know, and everyone converts to Islam eventually. Not everyone, but the majority of these populations convert to Islam over the course of the centuries. And so there's something compelling about the culture that they create, obviously. And there's a few other quirks, right? I mean, like in order to convert to Islam, you have to become an sort of honorary member of a tribe. So that plays a big role in Arabizing sort of conquered peoples, and as they convert, they have to become Arabic. But there's so much that happens with the Arabic language and with this this development of an image of what Arabs are, and I think the poets play such a huge role in that. That tends towards the legitimization of the caliph, and just an articulation of who he is, also how he's different from the other empires that still existed at that time. And they didn't stop fighting with the Byzantines just because they conquered Jerusalem or Egypt. So there's still this contest between, you know, who's the ruler of the universal monotheistic world. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And then me as a literature scholar, you know, the tripartite Qasida is so Suzanne Stepkovich said in one of the classes that I took with her, she said, for me, it's like, you know, an atomic theory. Like it's the basis for everything. And you can see that, you know, in later Arabic poetry, you know, my whole critique is that the tripartite Qasida is very contingent. It doesn't emerge until later. This is something that other, you know, Renata Jacobi has pretty much established as well from a historical point of view. And I'm sort of just adding the geographical aspect to it, the regional aspect. But it's just a very compelling structure for a poem. And the last poem that I translate in the book by Jarir for the Caliph illustrates this. It has beautiful water imagery all throughout the course of the poem. And the way that he organizes it is it's like there's water imagery in the beginning, there's water imagery in the middle. In the beginning, he's talking about his beloved. In the middle, he's addressing, well, actually, he addresses his wife supposedly in that poem. And then he's crossing the desert, and then he's going to the Caliph, who's a source of water of life for him in a more symbolic way. And so the structure of the tripartite Qasida, it is sort of the atomic structure of Arabic poetry. And it does have the more, I have a kind of weird relationship with it. Anyone who sees my Twitter account will notice that like every poet that I post about is basically someone no one's ever heard of before. Occasionally I post something by someone famous, but I more or less am like drawn in my scholarship towards the obscure marginal figures. And part of the reason is because when I was a graduate student, as I was learning about this stuff, I was reading a lot of stuff about the Qasida, and I got kind of sick of it. And a lot of people just read panegyric praise poetry for Islamic leaders across the centuries. It gets kind of tiresome. They're always praising the Sultan or whoever as like, you know, they're always generous, they're always killing everybody, they're always whatever. It can repetitive, and a lot of scholars have to try to sort of make this recuperative argument to say, oh, it's not just flattery, it's not just it's not insincere, there's more complexity to it. And you know, there's a lot of great work which has been done to sort of explain why panegyric, I mean, most Arabic poetry is panegyric, and there's been a lot of great work done to sort of get away from this dismissive attitude towards it, but I don't know, I still feel it in my bones. I get kind of, you know, just, you can't help it. You want to, I want to read about something else. But I will say, I've read like a lot of tripartite Qasidas by Mutanabi, by all these famous poets, by poets who are not very famous. And it's just an astonishing structure. It's something that this kind of thing never goes on my Twitter account, because it's very hard to convey unless you sit there and you know the tradition and you know what images they're drawing on, and you're willing to sit there with a 100-line poem and go through it. But all of the later poets, this whole tradition has an amazing way to, just like in this one by Jarir, to balance out all of these beautiful images, to introduce a motif in the first part and then resolve it in the third part. Yaroslav Stepkovich has compared it to a symphony with different movements. It's very musical. So I don't know, they just hit on something that really works. It works in a social way at a crucially important time for the legitimizing Islamic leaders, but then they left this, I don't know, this inheritance to everybody else who would come after them, this really great structure, which, yes, it's good for legitimizing leaders, but it's also, it's aesthetically just a very compelling symphonic way to organize to organize imagery in a way that really can be very affecting for readers and listeners if they were listening to the poetry.
Interesting. Sounds like that would make a really good book. Why the Qasida was so appealing and, became the standard for Arabic poetry later on. You mentioned you mentioned a group in your book who we were kind of sympathetic towards on this channel, and they are the Kharijites. And I was enthusiastic to see that you had something to say about their poetry. So my question is, how does Kharijite poetry, by offering an ideological basis rooted in Islamic practices for the transcendence of tribal affiliation, present a serious challenge to the emergence of the Umayyad Qurayshi legitimacy claims you just spoke about? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's one of the so I my lens of turning everything into a regional development, I applied that to the Kharijites. I was reading through their poetry. They're significant for this time period, and there were a couple of scholars, Hageman and Verkinderen, I'm saying their names correctly, that Andrew Marsham turned me on to when I was at Cambridge, who basically make this analysis from an historical point of view, that the Kharijites were all Nejdis, and a lot of them were from Bekr ibn Wa'il, which was a very important Iraqi tribe. It's really hard to figure out even like where to pin them down chronologically. Sometimes a lot of this poetry is sort of attributed to multiple figures, this contingency that I was talking about. And it wasn't taken care of. So the source that everyone uses now for this is Ahsan Abbas's edition called Sha'r al-Khawarij, which collects all of the poetry from the different miscellaneous sources and puts it all in one place. So it's a difficult source to work with, but it's interesting. Unlike the poets that have now become canonical, right? They did not respect Quraysh. This is their most famous theological tenet: is that they did not think that the imam had to be Qurayshi. And when you look at it, the overall historical picture seems to be that these were the tribes that weren't getting paid enough. And so this is, again, I'm kind of like thinking about this in modern contemporary terms, like an analysis right now of the revolt against Biden is that most of the congressmen who are calling for him to step down are the ones who are in the closest elections in their particular district. And so they have nothing to lose from challenging the president because they think they're going to lose the election if they don't challenge the president. And so like they're thinking my career is over either way, so I'm going to call on him to step down. That's simplifying it a little bit, but I see the Kharijites as being sort of the same. They are from the tribes that are in Iraq and Persia as military units. They're often from the ones that weren't getting paid as much from the sort of the centralized Diwan as the Hijazi, certainly as in Qurayshi tribes. So they're very much in that kind. To my mind, they're in this Nejdi western half, losing side of the Civil War. Iraq, place where the poetry was collected, area, rather than being with the Hijazis or with good Islamic credentials. And so it makes sense that they would be willing to challenge Quraysh, because it's like, what have they got to lose? We're already being paid too little. We're off fighting the hard fights in Khorasan and stuff like that. So that was their challenge. And I think that they, what's interesting to them about them is that they have this image, a lot of their imagery of a sort of, they also have an image of like an ideal male leader. And it's a sort of recurring thing that happens in their poetry, which is a little bit, actually seems a little bit more similar to the Hijazi model in some ways, although it draws on both aspects of it. And you sort of see this recurring feature of someone who just doesn't need anything. They have their horse, they have their spear, they have God, they have the Quran, and so as I was just talking before about how the Qasida is also this aesthetic battle, that, you know, it's not poetry that is, you're sitting down by the fireside reading about waterfalls. It's life or death for these people. I mean, their tribes are either going to be significant or insignificant in the state, based on, you know, whether they can cultivate a good relationship with the caliph, and so they're putting all of their you know, their energy into making that compelling. And the Kharijites are also putting in, you know, you see that a lot of medieval Islamic scholars liked this imagery that they created. It's a very attractive image of the individual Muslim who just doesn't need Quraysh, doesn't need anything. It's just sort of, you know, soul and death. That's like this the thing in the Kharijite poetry over and over again. And the way that they kind of weld this onto their own, what must have been something, you know, from their own situation. This, you know, I'm not really into like military history or any of this kind of stuff, but it just like boggles my mind the kind of life that they must have been leading to cross these sorts of distances, and that they managed to maintain the centralization that they had, to the extent that they had centralization of the military pay structure and the logistics and the organization. But you know, it must have been a pretty hardcore situation to be out fighting on the frontier. And they do, yeah, they do present a very sort of compelling counter alternative to, you know, life back at the center. They're sort of on the periphery, and there's the, you know, the people back at the center have got, you know, patronage and palaces and estates that they're being granted by the rulers and that kind of thing, and they're out there with the horse and the dust and the blood and sweat and everything. And so they have two visions of Islam, not surprisingly. And so that's the sort of my imagination of it. But I think that they're kind of continuing in a way on that early Najdi trend of they're Muslims now, but they're sort of continuing on that Najdi trend of being kind of resistant to the Hijazis, resistant to the Medinans. Sorry, not Hijaz. Continuing that Najdi trend of the early, the pre-Islamic poets of not really caring what's happening in, or wanting to be distant and independent from, whether it was the Medinans or the Muslims or the Caliph, whatever, just trying to assert this, this independence, which in a way makes a lot more sense in terms of the theology of Islam, which is not, doesn't come full born with like a how-to manual for Quraysh to rule the Ummah.
So just moving on to the Abbasids, and the work of the philologists during this period. So what are the earliest anthologies of Arabic poetry that get collected, and what can their sort of geographical and chronological parameters in terms of what gets transmitted tell us about how, and particularly why, that specific material was transmitted?
Yeah, so the thing that I discussed the most in the book, which I'll just give as the main example here, I think something that I've mentioned a couple of times actually that I should, this also in the first chapter of my book. We're talking about it sort of now at the end, but in the book I sort of felt the need to explain this at the beginning in order to deal with the Tah Hussein authenticity issue, is that there's these different streams of poetry transmission. So something that has been talked about when people actually look at tafsir is that so a lot of the poetry that's quoted in tafsir isn't in the diwans of a particular poet as it was collected by the scholar, you know, by a more poetry-oriented scholar. Likewise, chronicles, we were talking about the Sirah, that has poetry that has, you know, sort of middle register, linguistic register. And you see these other famous books like Heterarchy is much later, but it's like obviously coming out of a different milieu. It's not really, it sort of pretends that it's from a scholarly milieu, but it's mostly sort of fun, light stories, poems that can be suited to music the most easily. And then you've got what I call the philologists, the actual poetry scholars in Basra, Kufa, and Baghdad, and Iraq mostly. And they're the ones who really, I think, have got the most to offer us in terms of historically sort of there's a hope that they preserve some poetry, which really goes back to the pre-Islamic period. At the same time, it sounds like a conspiracy, but they have tendencies. And so al-Mufaddal al-Dabi is the one that I talk about the most often, al-Mufaddaliyat. That is 126 poems. And this guy al-Mufaddal, there's a story, apparently he was involved in education of the caliph's children. And there's those kinds of narratives recur with quite a lot of these people. So I mean, that's the first thing. This poetry is collected for the education of the rulers. And we don't really know the details of that, but it seems pretty plausible in this development of Arabness. So you have the poets that I was talking about developing imagery of Arabness, and they teach that to their children. And I mean, that like is becomes kind of a circular thing that the rulers teach the children how to, the future rulers, how to understand themselves in these terms. They go and they get tutors and they collect these anthologies. So al-Mufaddal was from obviously the tribe of Tabba. So this is one of these tribes that is significant in southern Iraq. They were involved in the conquests. They have connections with other Najdi tribes. They have connections with Persia. They went and they fought in that side of, they went in that direction, right? They didn't go towards Egypt and Maghreb. And so when you look at al-Mufaddal's background, he seems to be coming from, from Najd, from the early Najdi tribes that conquered Iraq, has connections with the Abbasid court, and there's indices that he has that are very similar to other collections. And he's living around like late 700s, so the very early Abbasid period. So the reason why I talk about him in my book is because the image that we have of Arabic poetry is coming so profoundly from Iraq and from Najd. Our image of the pre-Islamic poets is coming from Najd. Our image of the Umayyad poets is coming from Najd. Our image of the Abbasid poets is coming from these Iraqis that are their main aesthetic criterion is that style of poetry. So when they see a bad horse description, which is something that you want to see in Najdi poetry, they're like, okay, this is bad horse description, or this is some sort of weird poet because he doesn't have a horse, or whatever. They're always looking at things in these terms. And if you go through and you look at, this is one of the things that I did early on, a lot of these collections, I have the statistics in my book, I can't remember them anymore, but the Mufaddaliyat is like 80% Najdi, 85%. So you would think that if we're going to talk about pre-Islamic Arabs, we would have sort of people from all over the peninsula. And there's none from Oman or Yemen, basically, from the early period, which is probably that they just, even up until today, there's some non-Arabic languages in Yemen. But weren't really using Arabic, weren't using it for poetry. But regardless, you would think that from the rest of the peninsula, from the Hejaz, that we would have more material. There's like Kalb, Assyrian tribe. We've got very spotty material from them. That seems to be a selection bias issue, that these Iraqis didn't want to collect this Syrian tribe, mostly Christian tribe. They also didn't write Qasidas. They didn't write tripartite Qasidas. They just seem to have occasional little pieces. And a lot of it survives. It was recently collected. A few of these tribes have been kind of reconstructed by mostly scholars working in the Arab world. But to return to al-Mufaddal, that's the sort of gateway to becoming classical Arabic poetry, was getting into one of these guys' sites for the early Arabic poets. They had a particular notion of what they thought good poetry was, very nomadic, very they didn't like urban poetry, they liked Bedouin poetry. They wanted it to be pure Arabic, not connected to urban Arabic. They become explicit about the fact that they think Najd is the place where the best Arabic is spoken. When they get that assumption is kind of maybe a little bit later, but they develop that assumption. And yeah, it serves a purpose for them in terms of establishing their own credentials as Arabs and as Muslims and as someone who's connected to the elite. You know, if he was tutoring the caliph's sons or something. So that's an example. There's in every collector of poetry, there's like a little bit of a different story, but that's the earliest one that we have. That's probably the best example of how this originally like a regional development became preserved as something to be studied. It becomes classical. It becomes something for scholars to learn about, or leaders, rulers to learn about as, you know, something that's essential to their education. It becomes something that's central to understanding the Quran, which is not the case in the early Umayyad period. You have to read poetry in order to understand the Quran. Yeah, so they sort of established the groundwork. A lot of them were not, I mean, Al-Mufaddal seems to have had nothing whatsoever to do with tafsir, with exegesis, but he establishes the groundwork for sort of saying, oh, this is proper Arabic. So if you want to understand the proper Arabic of the Quran, you have to read the poetry as well.
He was a Quran scholar.
No, he was not. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you said
he
was not.
No, okay. So I thought maybe he was good with Qur'at, or was that?
He did read some. Yeah, he did study some Qur'at apparently, according to what we. Yeah.
But never came out with any works on the subject. Same thing with another collector of anthologies, Al-Asma'i. Same thing with Qur'at, but never came out any work. Seemed to focus all of his time on collecting poetry.
Yeah, exactly. And then, but they created this corpus of poetry, and then you see later, Mufassirin, later exegetes, drawing on that poetry that they collected in order to say, okay, here's something to explain something.
Yeah, so that's our next question. You know, when did poetry first start being used for Quranic exegesis, and what were the anxieties that prompted its use? I mean, like I had the understanding that, you know, Arabic poetry has always been referred to in terms of Quranic exegesis to understand Arabic words. I mean, most tafsirs in English, especially, or as well as in English, you'll find, well, if they didn't understand, they'll use a line of poetry in order to, you know, bring a definition. I found that interesting that it wasn't like that in its earliest period.
Yeah, and so here, I don't want to pass myself off as a tafsir expert, because I'm not, but it is, I have read a lot of tafsir. And it was one of my interests. Initially, when I began this project, what ended up happening was I decided that this book was actually going to be, I wanted to have maybe even more of this issue about like how poetry became, like maybe to have some sections about, my basic argument is that we should use Hijazi poetry to understand the Quran rather than Najdi poetry. It makes no sense to use this poetry, which is a lot of times you'll have like Mufassirin using like an Umayyad, Tamimi, Najdi poet to explain a term in the Quran. And that really doesn't make any sense when you think about it, because they are later, they're not from the same generation, they're from the other side of the peninsula. And so the conclusion of my book, which is very brief, you know, just sort of, I had reached the conclusion that this book needed to be sort of like a preliminary work towards anyone who wants to do this in the future. And I would love to see that, like a study that is just like, okay, let's just look at Hijazi poetry in as a way to try to understand the Quran's Arabic. But yeah, the general picture of poetry being used for the tafsir, for exegesis, is that it's not used initially. So early, and one of the things that's kind of strange about tafsir is why it exists in the first place, because there does seem to be this gap, which is also kind of similar to the gap in poetry of about like the first 50 years or something, where we really don't have anything. And then when tafsir does emerge, it seems as though early Muslims don't understand basic things about the Quran. And so there are some terms that they are just seem to be sort of mystified by. And so they're trying to explain it in this very writerly way with reference to poetry or to other scholars or whatever. So poetry gets brought in at that moment to try to explain some of the terms whose original context perhaps have become somewhat obscure during the first couple generations of Islam. The general stages, this is a bit reductive, but the general stages as I see it. So the example that I use is Abu Ubaida's Majaz al-Quran. He dies in 825. I don't know if we have a date for Majaz al-Quran, maybe like 800. So early Abbasid period, but a little bit later than al-Mufaddal, for example. What I see as being the stages is that, the Quran is revealed. Everyone understands the Quran. It's in Arabic, or the people who matter, the Hijazis, understand it. So there is an exegesis to speak of for the first generation or two. The earliest exegesis that we have is like sort of mid-Umayyad period. It's not using poetry. Separately, you have these philologists in Iraq who start collecting poetry. And around the same time that they're doing it, they are studying the Quranic tradition, supposedly, but they're not authoring works on how my poetry can help you understand the Quran. I think that's part of the sphere that they're working in, but they're not actually authoring works like that. The tafsir tradition does start to draw on poetry a little bit. And one of the things that Tah Hussein, one of his throwaway comments, is that so I don't find this quote is that he said, tafsir was written by the Mawali to explain why the Quran is an Arabic text, and it was written by by these converts, and then they started drawing on poetry to say, oh, this is Arabic, this is Arabic. And then finally, by the time that you get to someone like Abu Ubaidah Majaz al-Quran, he is explicitly saying, okay, I'm going to draw on poetry. And a lot of the poetry that he's drawing on is this Nejdi, sort of what becomes classical Arabic poetry. And I'm going to go back and explain the Quran this way. And I have a passage in the book where I, sort of point out that it doesn't make a lot of historical sense. Most of his, I just go through it quickly. Someone should do a more sustained analysis. But his explanation doesn't really help us understand the Quran because he's using poetry, which is often later. It's from a different part of the peninsula. And it really just doesn't clarify the Arabic at all. And part of what was motivating me for why this would matter, why the Quran's obviously Arabic. Why would anyone, where's Tah Hussein coming from when he's saying, oh, the non-Arab converts needed to explain that it was Arabic, was from At-Tabari's introduction to his famous tafsir Jami'. And that's much later. We're getting around the year 900 or something. But he has this long explanation of what the Huruf al-Sab'a means, the 7 letters or the 7 readings. And he just keeps going off on these tangents about how the Quran is pure Arabic. It has no non-Arabic words in it. It doesn't have any Syriac. It doesn't have any Persian or anything like that. And when you read that, you're like, where is this beef coming from? Who are you arguing with? And I think that, to me, and this is something that Peter Webb also kind of hints at, but doesn't really develop because I think we just don't have the information about it. I think it just really makes a lot of sense in the context of the early conquest period. And I'm thinking of the second half of the Umayyad period, after the year 700, that you have a new religion. The followers of it are a distinct minority within all of the places that they've conquered. And even the Arabians, I think, are basically, converting slowly. On the basis of poetic evidence, they're not getting really Islamic really fast. You don't see Islamic style in my period. So as it becomes sort of a thing, people can identify what a Muslim looks like, what an Arab looks like. There's it would make sense that there's critiques of Islam coming from Jews and Christians, and also a very sensible critique, and something that we see all over the place during the Abbasid period is, oh, this doesn't fit with the scripture. This is the real one in the Bible. That's not really an Arabic word. That's a Syriac word. This story, all of this kind of stuff, which becomes the sort of basis for, one of the things that's always struck me is that you can just go on the internet and see all of the interconfessional polemic between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and you can go back and you find it like 1,000 years ago. I mean, like, all of these things start so early on. So
let you know the future of these discussions, that they'll never be never be resolved.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why when I hear these conversations, I'm like, I'm not gonna participate in this, because this has been going on for 1,000 years. And but I mean, it makes sense to me, as this is, I think, what Hussein was onto, and I think that it makes a lot of sense, even if I don't really have a really concrete evidence for it until the later Abbasid period, that this makes a lot of sense as to like why the Quran as an Arabic scripture gains so much traction, is because when you make it Arabic, then you don't have to argue in terms of these other guys. You don't have to get into the Greek stuff or the Syriac stuff or whatever. And that's part of what makes this, current scholarly discussion so messy, is because people want to bring these things back in. And I think that the origins of the Islamic tradition, a lot of it is about Arabizing this material, sort of trying to say, okay, if you want to read the Quran, don't read it next to the Bible, read it next to Arabic poetry. And no one can argue that became the norm in Islamic education, that people, although it is striking how much, when you read Ibn Taymiyyah, you can tell that he's read the Bible.
I was about to say, seems like both were happening simultaneously, even though, they tried to not put a spotlight on one. It seems like the Bible is still being interpreted, although the sources were being fudged, or with, like in the case of Al-Tabari, you never know where maybe sometimes you have an idea of where he's getting it from if you have familiarity with the Bible, but then sometimes, that what he's citing is biblical, but it's like, from what source did he get it? Because he doesn't mention.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm simplifying things, but I think the general sort of trajectory of the Islamic tradition has been, I mean, you really see this by the Mamluk period. By the Mamluk period, there's really like sort of, you get the sense the scholars don't know what Christianity is, again, except for Ibn Taymiyyah. So there's some other sort of scholars that are kind of, I mean, two of the scholars where I've seen the most sort of biblical references, like it has them in Ibn Taymiyyah, are like some of the quirkiest scholars in the Islamic tradition, who are clearly reading the Bible. But generally, the general trajectory is to say, okay, like, if you want to be, sorry?
I was going to mention al-Baqi, or was he not, was he, he was in the Mamluk period. Am I pronouncing his last name, his name correct? Al-Baqi.
I don't know actually about that. I don't know very much about him.
Okay, never mind. We'll that.
But in general, if you look at Islamic curricula, the Arabic poetry is sort of referred to pretty constantly after this period as a sort of normative thing to read in order to understand Arabic, in order to understand the Quran. Other things never go away. There's a lot of acknowledgement in the tafsir that some of these words are Arabized. Some scholars, it doesn't bother them the way that it seemed to bother Tabari. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on over the course of the medieval period, but broadly speaking, Arabic gets established as the sort of ruler that you go to for understanding anything that seems linguistically difficult in the Quran. That's a good instinct. It is Arabic. Like I said, by the time that I was done writing this book, I kind of came to the conclusion that it was, to the extent that it offers any answers to that question, that sort of was more of a groundwork for later scholars to try to take this up a little bit, because there's, with everything with that, I have an enormous respect for the medieval, Islamic tradition, and my whole, education and background and approach is very philological. I just use all of these medieval scholars constantly for understanding anything. I'm completely dependent on them. So I just want to sort of have my agenda is for people to have this, to read this stuff carefully, these medieval texts, the Arabic texts, and to, and respectfully, but also not to bring on board all of these unnecessary assumptions that they did make for various social reasons that made sense to them, that don't help with understanding things from a source critical perspective, or any of the perspectives that we want to use now to understand history.
In terms of the Quran and what it's referring to when it's talking about al-Shir, and the thing that it differentiates itself from, what sort of rhyme verses do you believe it's referring to? Because it's obviously, as you mentioned, it's obviously not the poetic text that traditionally came to be seen as representing pre-Islamic poetry, like the Najdi poetry that you were referring to, that ends up being used for Quranic exegesis. So what is the rhymed verse that the Quran is referring to, and it's moving itself away from?
Yeah, well, so I mean, there's various explanations for that. Then the one that that I saw is an explanation that it's basically a synonym for kahin. And so poet Sha'ar in the Quran is another kind of soothsayer or minor prophet or some sort of cultic figure or something. There's the technical reasons. So I mean, the Quran rhymes, but it's not metered for the most part. And so and there's no like, all poetry that we have is at least in Vejas, and it has this, even the simplest poems that seem to have been by non-professional poets, these early poetry by women mourning their relatives or something that was just improvised, are in Reges with like rhyme repeated at the end of every line, but there's a meter to it. So I've always been a bit puzzled by this idea that the Meccans would accuse the prophet of being a poet just because it rhymes, because like you're leaving out half of the material for it. And I think also, just to emphasize, like, I mean, in English, meter doesn't really matter to us very much. English is, I don't know, in a lot of ways it's not a very poetic language, but for Arabic, I think it's very easy to memorize a line of poem based on the meter. You don't need the rhyme. So if you hear like something that is like anyone who's met any Arab who ever knows anything about poetry can tell that they can just recite stuff. And it's like the reason why you can memorize one line at a time is because it's in Tawil, and it has this sort of it has this rhythm to it that the Quran totally does not have. It has its own rhythm, but it just is, it's not metrical in the same way as the poetry is. So that explanation that it refers to some other thing that we just don't know about has always made sense to me. That was, I think I saw that in Retso, in Jan Retso. Yeah, I think he has an essay, and he probably talks about it in his book. Yeah, I don't think that there's that much hostility to poetry in the Quran. That particular poet, because that particular surah, because it's called Surah Ash-Shu'ara, and because there were later controversies about poetry, it gets like a lot of attention, but it always seems like a struggle to me to understand why something which is obviously such a pervasive institution in society, like why the Quran would come out and have an opinion about this. Like, obviously there's poetry everywhere.
Yeah, me too. I always felt that there was a bit of a mismatch when you see how how present poetry was pre-Islam, early Islam, and how it continued to proliferate throughout Islamic societies. And then we also have reports of the Prophet wanting to hear, I think, over 50 lines of poetry from someone who wasn't even a Muslim. because the person, the content could have been seen as Islamic. So then I just never understood why I always associated with that the poets were saying things that, they weren't doing. So they were basically liars, and that if you are to be poets, make sure that you're telling the truth and that it's in defense of Islamic ideals, because it seems like that was the criteria. So yeah, your book definitely, put my antennas up when you mentioned that, the poetry that the word that has been translated as poetry in the Quran couldn't have been referring to what we understood or what we understand as poetry, or what was commonly understood as poetry by the pre-Islamic Arabians, or by the early Muslims as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So just to try and tie all these threads together, um, so you highlighted obviously the neglect of Arabic poetry in historical research for reconstructing aspects of the early history of Arabia, the late antique early history of Arabia. And you attributed this sort of neglect to a form of Eurocentrism in a way. How do you hope this is going to be remedied by the publication of your book in August?
I mean, just on a practical level, I think that yeah, so there's a lot of elements. There's Eurocentrism, there's laziness, there's the lack of resources that the study of this kind of stuff gets in Western universities. There's the lack of resources that, I mean, I'm constantly amazed at scholars in the Arab world. I mean, it's just, some people produce this amazing work with these underfunded, poorly run universities. And so it's just this, it's such a struggle compared to, I mean, French literature. I just like look at these things. It's like, you pick up a book catalog of a university press, and there's just all of these editions and critical studies. I get very jealous, or I did back when I was in academia. So yeah, just on a basic level, I know that there's a lot of, I have a real beef with, like, I think a lot of everyone says in academia that they want to be interdisciplinary, and very few people really want to put in the effort that takes to do it. And it really is very, I think it's one of the most pernicious aspects of our, and in a neglected way, one of the most pernicious aspects of our sort of academic system is dividing everything up into disciplines and saying, you're going to do Islamic studies, you're going to do history, you're going to do literary studies. And these people, they do kind of talk to each other a little bit. And I think, ironically, one of the weird things is that supposedly the old-fashioned conservative Orientalist departments, which is where I've entirely lived my life, like University of Cambridge and University of Chicago, are just very academically conservative places, are the best places for real discussions to happen between scholars, because they're in like everyone says, oh, you shouldn't, lump everyone in the East together. And it's like, yeah, well, you shouldn't, but there's not enough resources to study, just Tibetans, or just, Buddhism, or just whatever. So they get lumped together for a logistical reason. And then I met and talked to people who are doing all of these weird things, like I was talking about with Sanas Fard, Assyrian archaeology, that I would never run into if these departments didn't just lump us together for no apparent reason. And then people go and they do Islamic studies and they don't read poetry, or they go and they do literary studies and they haven't read the Quran. It's just it's insane, like some of the assumptions people think that you can make.
And I mean,
the worst part,
preparing for this pod, I mean, not to interrupt you, but you touched on a very interesting point that I heard a lot as I was preparing for this podcast, because I was asking a lot of people who work within the field of Islamic studies about pre-Islamic poetry, and they, were saying things like, don't know too much about it, it's too difficult to deal with. I think one even said that he had to refer to you a few times through some kind of correspondence. And yeah, I was actually quite surprised. Because well, maybe I shouldn't have been quite surprised, because I held the same. I'm outside of the field of Islamic studies, but as I mentioned earlier on, I had the same assumptions, not that I couldn't use it, but that it was useless. And I was wrong for having those kind of ideas. But yeah, I was just quite surprised by the people. I don't want to say that they're lazy, but their inability to deal with this genre of literature, even though they focus or their main area of study is the emergence of Islam, pre-Islamic Arabia, but just find this kind of material difficult and obfuscated from their research.
Yeah, and so I should probably like walk back a little bit what I said about people being lazy, because like there's only so much that you can do. And I mean, I dedicated years of my life to this thing. It's not like it just like it wasn't easy for me.
Well, hey,
and
maybe that term might help motivate some people who know that's their situation.
But I think people should make an effort. I mean, there are people, for example, Andrew Marshall uses a lot of poetry in his studies of Umayyad history. So it's very feasible, but I think that more than just the effort that it takes, or the lack of resources that we have in conducting this kind of research, is methodological. So as I was going through, and I think part of the, you were saying that you had to sort of read the book a bit more carefully than you were expecting, and I think part of the issue is that there is a sort of, like a lot of bands have like one good album they come out with, and then they never repeat it because they like spend 10 years struggling and they put all their blood, sweat, and tears into the, every track. And then the second album comes out and people are like, what's this garbage? This is basically the way that my book is going to be. Like, I mean, I'm not in academia anymore. I'm not going to produce any more research studies of this density. And I put a lot of effort into it.
Definitely tell.
Maybe it should have been more than one book, but it is what it is. But I also wanted it to be a resource. To return to your question of like, what do I want this to accomplish? I mean, I don't want everyone to be an Arabic poetry scholar. That would be insane. But for someone who knows Arabic, or who works in the field, or who has any interest in it, I want someone to go and just like have a book that makes sense historically, and that offers some resources that offers a narrative as to how this stuff developed, and that connects it to other things that are happening that will make some sense from a linguistic, from an historical point of view, rather than something which is only valuable to people in literary studies. Because it's such a niche field, I would never expect anyone to read this book if I just wrote another, development of stylistic devices in Houdel's poetry or something. I mean, I could literally email that to everyone, to 50% of the people in the world who study this, in an afternoon, and I would have disseminated it. But what I would really like to happen is for people who work on the Quran, people who work on early Islamic history, to read this and be like, oh, okay, this makes a lot more sense as a, just as a naturalistic, rational explanation for why styles developed, for why it's important to know the difference between different styles, for how Arabs related to non-Arabs. Here's some archaeological evidence, epigraphic evidence, and just common sense. I mean, like I'm a very, back when I was doing English literature, I read a lot of literary theory, and I'm kind of post-theory now. There is some, phenomenology and stuff in the book that reflects my background. But I think a lot of studies these days can get, and this is a typical complaint about academia, they can get too focused on their discussions. And so I hear a lot of, good papers I did, a lot of good papers at conferences and things that are dealing with early Islamic history, but they're often very technical and very, you can make a assumption based on what's the sort of methodological technical norm in your field at the moment, which is just, not, is easily falsifiable if you just read more stuff. And the original context of medieval, of all of our source material, is that all of these people were polymaths. I mean, there's just, I don't think we have an excuse for only reading literature or only reading chronicles, when all of our sources were people who, like, I've never read poetry by a puppet, but like a lot of these people who are writing chronicles also wrote poetry. A lot of people who were writing fiqh also, did tafsir. A lot of people who were doing any of these range of genres that we've dissected for our disciplinary purposes, we're making connections between all of these different things. And so I just want to facilitate those connections. And as I've, as I've drawn on, as I've made these arguments, I found, like, for example, Marine Van Putten, who, is very active on Twitter. This guy's book about the Quran, and I only came across him through Twitter, really, and read his book. He's making some of the same arguments that Quranic exegesis needs to be understood in terms of, like, this. Well, I don't want to make his describe his argument incorrectly, but he's paying a lot of attention to Najdi and Hijazi reading traditions of the Quran, and he gives that its due, and that's what's there in the sources. They were really they were actually pretty obsessed with the difference between Najdis and Hijazis. So it behooves us to go back and pay attention to that, and to say, okay, this is actually like a real category that they saw themselves through. And then for people to say, okay, well, maybe I'm doing exegesis or I'm doing history or something, but the poetry is, seems more approachable to me now if you read my book.
Moran is one person who mentioned that he's excited for your book to come out because he can't wait to read it for himself. And I guess there's reasons why that you just mentioned, that he's dealing with this Hijazi Najdi dichotomy within his field of work. So I think there'll be a lot in it that he finds interesting. And
no, just in terms, like, you've sort of suggested that this is your final word on the subject, that you're not planning to publish any more in-depth books about early Arabic poetry texts. But if you were going to hand the baton on to somebody else, what do you hope further exploration in the academic sphere on these texts will do? What are you looking forward to happen in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, give the example. This is the example that sort of floats around in my mind. I've never really developed it. It might be something like an article. Is like bees and honey in early Islamic society, and this is still the case. Actually, you can get this like honey from the mountains in southern Saudi and Yemen. It's really expensive and prized in the Gulf these days. But so Hudayl have a unique to their tribe kind of little thing that they talk about, which is honey collectors. So there's this guy who is poor, he's wearing rags, he doesn't have any good equipment. He goes and he climbs up using ropes up onto these mountains where the bees make their honey, and he grabs the honey and then sort of tries to avoid getting stung as he steals their honey and makes his way back to home and then sells it. You see descriptions of honey in Mecca through like here and there, that it was kind of a commodity, an important commodity. And so Hudayl has these descriptions, and sort of Nahl is a sort of admiration for the bee and how the bee is kind of this sign of God's ability to create things and transform things. And then I found there's a, if you go back, it might be Eric Weinloch, there's one of these German scholars went through and like actually listed how that image of the honey collector in early Islamic poetry developed, because it's always used to talk about the beloved's kiss. They don't sit down to describe honey. They say, kissing my beloved is like a mixture of wine and honey, which is something that is like, to me, sounds disgusting, but apparently they mixed wine and honey in pre-Islamic Mecca. So they always say kissing the beloved is like it's intoxicating and as sweet as this beverage that they drank. So there's some German essay where they go, and it's footnoted in my book somewhere, where they go through and they find out there were earlier poets, and some of them were Najdi, who mentioned the honey collector, but like in one line. And then there's about a half dozen of those references that are 1 line, 2 lines or something. And then Hudayl takes it and runs with it and develops this full sort of episode. And they have these extremely lengthy descriptions of the beloved's kiss that just goes on for like 10, 20, 30 lines describing this wine and honey collection, or wine buying from, the wine comes from Syria, the honey comes from Yemen. So all the stuff is there in the book. If someone wants to write that article, that would be the kind of thing that I think would be interesting, rather than going and taking, I'm so like over Imr al-Qais's Mu'allaqah. So many essays and things have been written about the Mu'allaqat. I would like everyone to just, bracket the Mu'allaqat for the next 10 or 20 years and go and read all of the other stuff that is out there. And if they want to interpret the Quran, do an analysis of it, then to draw on the relevant materials and include poetry, yeah, I'll leave it at that. That's one example. But I mean, there's a lot of things that I think people could be doing with poetry that hopefully this will ease things a little bit. And also, I want it to be interesting to general readers because as I mentioned this in the conclusion to the book, this is something that when you're introduced to the Quran or whatever, you're like, okay, Arabic poetry is Diwan, it's the register of the Arabs, or the archive or whatever, and it's in popular discussions all over the place. You hear it in khutbahs if you go to the mosque, it's not wrong, but it's kind of a simplistic image of the Jahiliyyah or pre-Islamic period that was, it has a history. We can unpack it pretty readily now. And if we want to understand those early days of Islam, I think that it's still a very important source, but we need to update our tools in quite a lot of ways. That I hope the book goes in sort of in that direction, just of kind of thinking about what was it really like? I mean, this is, I don't know, I have a sort of natural human capacity, curiosity about historical origins that I think everybody has, and they're trying to imagine this massive world historical event, this emergence of Quran, and what was it really like back then? If you took a trip in Arabia, what was that like? And so I was really kind of trying to answer that book. Poetry offers that. I mean, with all of the reservations that you have to know about generic conventions and intertextuality and blah, blah, blah. I think poetry gives us a very nice sense, more so than a lot of other kinds of sources, about what it was like to just sort of live socially and in this time period, which is what everyone, historians, sort of interested, and anyone interested in Islam really wants to sort of imagine how did this happen? What was it like to be around at that time? And I think that can get really lost in the way that people are doing scholarship now, again, with the Syriac hagiography and stuff that is, we need to go back to what was it actually like in Arabia at this time. And I think poetry is a window. It's a smudgy window, but it's a window into what life was like back then.
Right. I believe it definitely is a window, a really good window, and that, it kind of focuses things on where the event was actually happening. Whereas, like you mentioned, they focus on Syriac, maybe, and rightfully so far to the north, and then at the same time focus on what was going on in Southern Arabia on the eve of Islam, which, has yielded a lot of interesting results. But, poetry definitely kind of puts you right in the thick of where, Islam emerged in that Hijazi, in the Hijaz, of course, but then also brings in what was going on in terms of Central Arabia. And we know that the Central Arabian tribes were very instrumental to the emergence of Islam. And so, I believe you're right in that sense. It was a very phenomenal book, Dr. Miller. I really believe it's going to be one of those that a lot of people are going to refer back to for a long time, until someone comes out with something to top this, which I think is going to be very difficult to do. Only try to focus on certain topics and maybe expound on those further. But I really think yours is one for the books, so to speak. And is there anything else you'd like to mention before we take off? I know you said that this might be your last project, but I really hope that it's not. Do you have anything in the works, any other aspects of this book that you might want to talk about? You're very active on Twitter still, translating poetry. I really like your translations. Are you thinking about coming out with a compilation of these I'm just hypothesizing, I guess, but I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm very interested in translation, and I think that this is something else, again, with with these texts, like, so I mentioned the Germans, they just have so many translations. And so, like, for example, all of the Hudel tribe's poetry has been translated into German. So if you're a native German speaker, a lot of what I'm saying shouldn't be super surprising if you're a scholar or if you're interested in these kinds of things. In English, it just doesn't exist. I mean, there's a few things that are, and they're old and that kind of thing. So it would really be, I would like to, when I'm quite interested in translation. Yeah, I developed, after I finished this book, I got kind of tired of the early stuff because so much of it is become very speculative very quickly because we have such poor sources. My articles after I finished I finished the book years ago because this is how academic publishing works. But since then, my research moved on to the Ayyubid period, to the 12th century. And I really enjoyed the broader range of topics that you get in the later medieval period in Arabic, people writing about, fleas and, their work situation. I don't know, there's poems about, there's an interesting thing in the later medieval period. There's a lot of disrespect for teachers. So the people who are teaching in the Kutab, the traditional boys' school where you memorize the Quran, there's a lot of negativity about those teachers in various sources. Anyway, so I got more interested in that. I might like to try to make a compilation of that sort of quirky, weird stuff. I've actually have a translation of all of Hudel's poetry, but it's like a scholarly translation. It's not fun to read. And I've talked to a publisher about publishing that. It's a matter of sitting back and making the time. So that might be a project. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to do any more research. Really, I've sort of said what I have to say about both the Ayyubid periods and the pre-Islamic, early Islamic periods. But yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't figured out how best to do that because publishing takes such a long time. You don't want to.
Yeah, I was surprised how long it takes to put out a book within academia as well as articles. Like I've had friends who said that, yeah, man, I wrote this article years ago and it only was published in a journal last month. And
yeah,
it's very interesting how that works.
Yeah. So when I was in academia, I had the genres there right for me. I was like, I have to publish a monograph, I have to publish peer-reviewed articles. No one's going to care if I publish translations, so I won't. And now that I don't have those restrictions, I don't actually know what to do because I'm a bit concerned that picking another subject will take 5 more years of my life. So I'm meditating upon what the next step will be.
So I guess, well, thank you for your time. This was an awesome interview. This was, your book was amazing. I guess my last question, and I saw this an interview with I think a Syrian poet named Adonis.
Okay.
And then I also read something in Tariq Khalidi's his history of classical or how Arab historical thought in classical Islam or something like that, that he was under the assumption that Islam kind of enfeebled Arabic poetry. And I read something from Al-Asma'i who kind of confirmed that he felt that pre-Islamic poetry was better, had more fuhul. Is that the word? Rather than rather than what was to transpire after the Islamic period. And Adonis mentioned something that before Islam, you can talk about all kind of things, existential problems and whatnot. And the Islamic period kind of removed a lot of those aspects of Arabic poetry. Do you agree with that or you disagree with that? Was Adonis spot on when he was mentioning that? Maybe because he's coming from a non-religious, he seems to be a non-religious person, so maybe he's inclined towards that view. But would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would agree with very much of that. I don't know. There's quite a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of complexity in early Arabic poetry. It shouldn't be reduced to like a bunch of, lizard eaters in the desert. It's a sort of Persian medieval stereotype of Arabs. Yeah, and I mean, modernity brings its own, if you're getting up to Adonis, Adonis, then there's a lot more that you can do with poetry, but your readership is limited. I think that's the thing that I would probably draw people's attention to, is just the role of poetry. I mean, it's just in English, it's become so socially irrelevant. At least gets a little bit of respect in the Arab world. But the trade-off is that it's less socially relevant. The more that you can talk about, the less you can really, the less you're really engaged with society. And the world of English poetry is now just these little journals and people at universities and people who are really into this niche stuff, unless you're talking about like book talk or something kind of poetry. It's been very academicized. And essentially poetry in the Arab world is a different kind of animal. It's interesting. People know Adonis, Nizar Qalani, Mahmoud Darwish. These guys a lot more than they know, than the average English speaker can even name a poet.
I was surprised when we had a podcast on Persian poetics or Persian poetry, and when I was researching for that, just how much the average Persian speaker, the average Iranian was in tune with poetry, how much it was a part of their everyday life and their upbringing. And that's something that you really don't see in the English speaking world anymore, which is, in my opinion, sorely missed. But on that note, thank you for your time. We're not going to hold you up any longer. And I recommend everyone to please go and purchase this book when it comes out. I mean, it's really phenomenal. And I believe there's much to speak about. And, we're not able to cover every aspect of the works of the guests who we bring on. So, really go and read these works, because a lot is left out of these podcasts. And on that note, thank you, Dr. Miller, for your time.
Okay. Thank you guys both very much. It was really a pleasure.